you can point to other specific things and say, well, like Russia does this worse. And I can point to certain things. Ukraine does this worse. It's not just the election. It's also the language bans. It's also the religion bans.
The language bans is worse? Really?
Yes,
Let's
yeah.
Oh, God.
Wick, hold on.
Wick,
There is no...
Wick, I gotta... You said we got to get back to the main topic.
Gang, we are going to be discussing tomorrow's summit, the Alaskan summit between Trump and Putin. Much has been said regarding this. Trump has come out and said that he suspects Putin is finally ready to make a deal. What does that mean? What kind of deal do we think is going to be made? Should any deal at all be made without Zelensky present, or can it be made? Is Putin simply just playing Trump again for a fool? We're going to talk about that, what we expect to happen, what we hope will happen, and what will probably happen. We got some great people to talk about it with us. Why don't we start by introducing yourselves? We'll start with Dylan, and we'll just kind of go around. Tell people who you are, what you do, why they should listen to you.
Sure, my name is Dylan Burns. I'm a streamer from the state of Maryland, Go Blue Crabs. And I also go and I do embeds with the Ukrainian military very regularly, like 6-8 months out of the year. I'm over in Ukraine. So I've been trying to do my best to understand the war and talk about it. So if you want to understand the war or want some opinions on domestic political news, you can find that at Dylan Burns Television.
Check him out, gang. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate you. Lonerbox, who are you? What are you doing? Why should we listen to you?
I'm Lonerbox. I'm a streamer and video essayist occasionally on youtube.com. I also tweet sometimes and I do debates, and I like foreign policy.
Based. Well, welcome here. We're glad you're here, and we'll see how this goes. Not Dylan Burns, Lactoid TV. How are you doing, lads? It's a shit show today. We're coming in hot, okay?
How you doing, Wick? Yeah, I'm Lactoid. Find me at Lactoid TV. Basically, most places. I'm here in the lion's den. I think I might have a little bit of a different position than the other panelists here and most of your audience. So, but we'll just roll with it.
I guess we'll see. Well, I guess let's just start up, open the discussion. What do we think is going to happen tomorrow? Do we think that Trump is going to be able to get anywhere with Putin? Why or why not? Open floor. Let's discuss it.
Well, first off, let's use Trump's measure of success. He said there's only a 25% chance of failure tomorrow. So he says waters are good. Waters are fantastic. So, he's always been right when it comes to the timeline on this war. So I believe him.
Fair enough. What do you think, Loner? What's the odds here? Is it 25% failure rate, or what are we thinking?
I think it's probably a bit higher than 25%. I think Trump, for whatever reason, just doesn't care or doesn't know that Putin's demands are kind of not workable. If you have any ethical stance on the conflict at all. I don't know, the last thing I read was that Putin might be offering financial incentives to Trump at the Ukraine summit. So it's just I think it's probably likely to fail. Trump has no idea what he's doing. He also has an incredibly weird soft spot for Putin, and he's going to get taken out for a ride again.
What do you think, Dylan? Is Lactoid? What do you think, Lactoid? Why am I calling you Dylan?
Is it the beard? I know it's new.
I don't know what it is, but I need to stop that right now.
Short hair Dylan and long hair Dylan.
Lactoid, tell me, what are your thoughts? Do you think it's a 25% failure rate? You've voted for Trump, correct?
Yeah.
Are you satisfied with how he's been handling this?
No.
With Ukraine and Russia.
Not particularly, or I guess not as much as I think I could be if he was harder on Ukraine. It seems like he's reversed course. Kind of initially he was harder on Ukraine, and then he sort of reversed course and, has been putting a lot more rhetoric on Russia. Although that might be just strategic coming up to this. I don't know. I think that he does like to be seen as the peacemaker. He does like to be seen as getting deals done. He really emphasizes peace deals that he either had a hand in or is at least optically seen as having a hand in, right? So like the most recent one, Armenia and Azerbaijan, he's been really playing that up and putting that all over social media. It's really important to him to be seen that way. In terms of the actual percentage chance of peace being reached tomorrow, I think 25% failure rate is highly, highly optimistic. I don't know where I'd put it. I'd put it higher than that. I think there's a good chance that I think one of two things is going to happen. A deal is going to be made, which I think is like the lower percentage chance, or some kind of deal that Trump believes to be a good deal in the situation is reached, which he then presents to Ukraine, and Ukraine says no. And then Trump uses that and say, look, like Ukraine's not playing ball, they're not negotiating, and we're not going to give them more money, and we're not going to put more effort into their war machine. So, I mean, either one of those alternatives would be good to me. I guess there is the third alternative, which is he just gets really upset and says like, oh, we're going to double down and we're going to give even more money. I think that's like worst case scenario, but I think that also has a pretty low chance of happening. But again, exact percentages are going to be tough.
Okay, I guess my thoughts on this is that Trump and Putin, or Trump specifically, I don't know what he expects to happen, but does anyone here know what Putin's demands will be tomorrow? Do we have any idea? What do we think that Russia wants? What do we think is going to be offered up by Putin? Where's his starting point?
It's changed a lot in the reports from the White House. Originally, what Steve Witkoff told the Europeans is that the proposal was going to be that the Ukrainians pull out of Donetsk and Luhansk, and the Russians pull out of Kherson and Zaporizhia, and they do a land swap. And there was a lot of rhetoric around land swap. Trump talked about land swap in the media, land swap this, land swap that. Then within 24 hours of them telling Europeans that, that started to change. And within 48 hours, Steve Witkoff informed the Europeans that the only offer on the table as of right now is that the Russians are demanding that the Ukrainians withdraw from both Donetsk and Luhansk, and that for a ceasefire, that means Zaporizhia and Kherson frontline could possibly be frozen for the time being. This is not an abandonment of any other demand. For example, the capitulation of Zaporizhia and Kherson to Russian occupation. This is not them walking back on demilitarization as a key demand, which they've been making since the first days of the war to limit Ukrainian armed forces, or neutrality. So I suspect to see something that's basically in line with what the Russians have been asking up until this point in order to get a ceasefire, probably not a peace deal. Whether that ceasefire lasts for long, whether it's going to be 6 months, 12 months, years, or it actually transitions into a peace deal, it's impossible to say at this point, but I just simply don't think that the structures are in place to make a peace based off of that likely.
Yeah, how even likely is a ceasefire in this situation? Trump, I believe, has said that he wants the fighting to come to a stop and hopes that at least this meeting can lead to at least a temporary reprieve in the hostilities. But do we see that as any sort of realistic kind of thing happening? I just don't know.
The Russians would need to get something in order for there to be a ceasefire because they have the momentum now, and they have for a little while. But the land gains continue, and just recently, I know the war is kind of like tit for tat, but generally speaking, the Russians are making gains. And just recently, they made a relatively significant gain north of Pokrovsk. So just coming into this negotiation, they have a pretty big piece of land that's been captured. I actually agree that Russia's probably going to come to the table with the list of demands that they've had. I mean, as reported by the Kiev Institute of Sociology, we have the following demands. Ukraine must significantly reduce its army and limit armaments, permanently renounce NATO membership. Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk all come under Russian control, and Ukraine recognizes that along with Crimea. Ukraine then moves towards the European Union. It's interesting how that is within the Russian conditional plan. They concede that Ukraine moves into the EU, and then the US and Europe lift all sanctions against Russia. So, I mean, this is their maximal goal. I don't see Russia giving up any of the land that is currently taken. I could maybe see some deal where they surrender Kherson on the other side of the river and maybe some sections of Zaporizhia up north. But I don't think they're going to surrender like the potential of all of Donetsk and Luhansk. I think that's absolutely kind of line in the sand situation when it comes to this negotiation. So, I mean, we might see that. We might see some kind of offer of, look, we can make a deal now and then, figure some kind of split out with those two territories, but then complete control of the other two.
Do you think that's a reasonable ask, Lactoid?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable ask.
What do we think? Other side. Lonerbox,
oh.
Go ahead.
Wait, we think territorial. What do we think is reasonable ask? Like territorial concessions from Ukraine
Yeah.
for Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk.
All of Donetsk, all of Luhansk, and then I think a good compromise could potentially be the currently occupied parts of Kherson and Zaporizhia.
So, and Ukraine has to recognize this.
Yeah. I mean, unless there's going to be some future war about it.
So we've just told the entire world that it's it's okay if you'll get rewarded if you take territory by force that's not yours.
I mean, I guess you could frame any peace deal this way. Were we rewarded by, you can just go in and change government by force? To some extent, sure. There's going to be some, I guess, perception that comes with military success.
I believe since World War II, we've kind of agreed as an international community that it's not a good way to do things this way, right?
Not necessarily.
No?
There's been territorial conflicts since World War II, including territorial conflicts started by NATO.
Ones where an aggressor has captured territory and the rest of the world has been like, yeah, that's good. And the defender has to recognize it, just for the sake of getting it into the war. When? Which is a good comparison.
Kosovo.
Kosovo was... How is Kosovo comparable to... Did Kosovo aggress on Serbia from...
No, Kosovo was created from Serbia because of a unilateral NATO invasion, despite the fact that the UN deemed it to be illegal.
What was happening?
There was an ethnic cleansing campaign happening, but if you want to appeal to some kind of justification for military action, Russia's going to appeal to its own justifications for military action in the East. Whether or not there's valid justification, I think is perhaps the part that needs to be argued. But I didn't see that as your original point. It seems like your original point was, if there's any kind of military conquest, is this a good thing to reinforce?
Yeah, I wasn't expecting Kosovo, but Kosovo was not military conquest by any means. Kosovo and Kosovar independence was on the table and demanded by the people in Kosovo all the way since the 80s. It's not their fault that every time they tried to raise the issue, they got repressed and shot and imprisoned as political prisoners, and even people student movements getting shot and killed. They were subjected to total state repression. And then when that violence escalated, then yeah, that's when NATO came in. But Kosovo was a group of people that were seeking independence fairly across the board, and they were not given any possible avenue to try and bring that issue forward to the nation. And then obviously before NATO bombed Yugoslavia, there was the Serb army was about to go on a new offensive into the area after people were already fleeing in the hundreds of thousands. So to compare that to an act of aggression that gets rewarded by the international community vis-a-vis Russia, that's completely not comparable.
Is occurred.
So I think it's comparable in the sense of one military power taking unilateral action and then being rewarded for it, right? So, and that is what happened. If you want to talk about, the people there wanted independence, right? You're kind of referring to what the people there want, and then therefore that could justify some other power going in there, and despite the fact that it's illegal according to the UN, another power going in there and kind of giving the people there what they want. I think Russia's going to make the exact same argument when it comes to Crimea. Russia's going to make the exact same argument when it comes to Donetsk and Luhansk, right? I think the argument gets tougher when we're talking about Kherson and Zaporizhia, but those territories, Russia's going to make different arguments regarding that. Sure, there's going to be some element of them claiming that the people there want it, but I think there's also going to be strict geopolitical water supply into Crimea, et cetera.
Not to interrupt.
Yeah, but the difference is that NATO and America weren't claiming Kosovo for themselves. It was for the Kosovars. And second of all, there is far more evidence that Kosovars wanted to be independent from Serbia versus the idea that any majority of people in Donetsk or Luhansk wanted to be joined with Russia, not least of all through annexation.
Initially, a lot of the data comes from around the time of Minsk I and Minsk II. And you're right that those polls indicate that they wanted autonomy and separation from control from Kiev. This was, basically one of the demands of Minsk II was that Ukraine federalize, and Ukraine refused to federalize. They refused to put that into their constitution. in accordance with Minsk II, and they also refused to recognize elections in Donetsk and Luhansk. They just absolutely refused to follow those terms of Minsk II. And so, yes, if you look at those pollings around those times, you're going to see most of those people, we don't really want to be part of Russia, but we also don't want to be under the control of Kiev. We want to have our own kind of like independent entities. And this was the initial demand made by Russia 3 months after the 2002 invasion in Istanbul, for example. The initial proposal given by Russia to Ukraine 3 months after the 2022 invasion did not involve Luhansk or Donetsk going to Russia. All it did was simply enforce Minsk II, with obviously the added exceptions of recognizing Crimea and the fact that Ukraine has to disarm and can't join NATO. So those were, I guess, some of the additional demands, but it did not involve any kind of land swap. It was only
also
after Ukraine refused that land.
Yeah, but it's also, not to mention in this time when there are Russian troops and military installations in eastern Ukraine. I feel like that's not the right time to be giving federal autonomy to a region. And also, Minsk II was also contingent on.
Did the Ukrainians not agree to Minsk II? They agreed, and then they reneged on their agreement.
Didn't Minsk II also involve a recognition from Russia that they had soldiers in the east of Ukraine?
They said they would withdraw their soldiers, and their soldiers were there.
But they obviously couldn't because they denied there were soldiers there. Yeah.
No, hold on. My understanding is Minsk II required certain pieces of heavy weaponry be removed for a certain amount of feet behind the front line. That was my understanding.
It was
not like Russian generals,
fighters and mercenaries.
So the Minsk II said that Russia could have soldiers in Ukraine, Russian soldiers, in part of the Russian Federation's army, not part of local militia or foreign volunteer.
I do want to kind of get back to the summit specifically.
Yeah,
but I think this is a good foundation.
I wanted to get back to the summit. We're all going a bit off on Kosovo.
Yeah.
If you want my honest opinion about the odds of success, I think it's tremendously low. Steve Witkoff didn't know what was even being offered to him by the Russians and then misreported it. Whether or not the Russians lied to him and he got manipulated that way, or whether or not Steve Witkoff misunderstood them after he relied on another Russian translator I have no clue, but he didn't know what it was. And so I think a lot of this early talk about land swaps and a deal, and I think Putin truly wants peace, started to get deafened once, Russia continued to assert the same positions that they've had before, which have been unworkable. And so Trump has reeled in his position from we're negotiating these land swaps to these aren't really even negotiations. They're more like a feeling out process, like we're playing footsie under the table with Putin, and you can't do that over the phone. I don't know why we need to have Putin come over to the United States and Alaska for a feeling out process if it's no longer negotiations. So it seems like exactly what they expected from this changed very rapidly. They didn't put a lot of time into organizing it. It was very haphazard. And so putting aside just the dotting the I's and crossing the T's on the details of it, it didn't seem like it was particularly executed that well. As for abandoning the defenses in the Donetsk region or abandoning the last part of the Luhansk region, this is not a workable proposal for the Ukrainian side, not only because it would be met with immense fury from the public and for those in the armed forces, but also because in the Donetsk region, there are still a lot of, quite frankly, defensible, high located on the heights positions that they've built over time. And while I drive over there, I can see very clearly them preparing for the defenses of key cities like Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. And so I don't think that they are interested in giving it up without a fight, especially since the Russians, again, have yet to relinquish claims on territories like Kherson and Zaporizhia. And so why give up land that is defensible when the Russians have yet to indicate that they're not even going to invade you for the other land they still claim to? And what the Russian foreign minister just said, hey, it's in the Russian constitution. We can't take it out.
Go ahead, Lactoid. Do you want to respond to that?
You do see this
Lactoid, but sure.
Yeah, I didn't really feel it was, but you do see both sides. I think Ukraine pulled the same thing where they were saying, look, it's in our constitution now, we can't give it up. Whether or not this is going to actually be an impediment, I'm skeptical. It seems like in order to get some kind of peace deal, Putin would surely be able to convince his parliament to do that. And I think it likely is true on the other side as well. So, I mean, I don't, unless, and if that's not the case, then now we have like a very kind of difficult situation where you have a president in Ukraine that is beyond his term, right? And so potentially lacks legitimacy, who's now negotiating at the kind of world stage when he doesn't even have his own parliament behind him. And in that situation, I don't really know what can be done, right? Because who do you send to do further negotiations then? I don't know.
Well, I mean, the Russians haven't been willing to negotiate with Zelensky when he was within the 2019 to 2024 term before its extension due to the Electoral Commission's policies on martial law. Or before, like, so I don't really know if him, like, for example, if they had an election tomorrow and Zelensky won, do you seriously think Putin would start treating him as a legitimate leader? I don't think that is really, whatever your position is on Zelensky Lactoid, I don't think that is either an impediment or not an impediment to peace. I think Putin, quite frankly, just wants a better dancing partner that's going to be more conciliatory towards his demands, but the Ukrainian people, broadly speaking, don't want that type of a dancing partner in negotiations. So I just don't think, even if they had an election and Zelensky was replaced, that he would be replaced with like somebody who would be conciliatory in that way. Like pulling out of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions for a ceasefire, not a peace deal, so the war could reignite later after you've given up these defensible positions, is an astronomically unpopular position in Ukraine. When you poll people, like the position that they have is largely speaking like, we'll be willing to do, like, maybe we can do swap for swap, but maybe we'll recognize Crimea, maybe we'll swap this for that, but they want something for something. Them giving up territory, not for a peace deal, but for a ceasefire that might break down. It's just, it's not a question of whether or not it's popular or legitimacy. It's just something that no Ukrainian government would see as tenable.
Here's a question for you, Dylan. Actually, I'm very curious. Because you've spoken to the Ukrainian people, you've been there, you've seen the region and things like that. Is there any deal that Russia could offer the people? I guess, what are the Ukrainian people actually willing to give up? Like, you talked about how they don't want to give up these defensible positions for a ceasefire, but is there anything that you think that the Ukrainian people would be like, okay, well, I guess since you're twisting our arm, we could do X, Y, or Z? Or do you think that there are a lot of them, or most of them, are in it to just like, we need to just press back as much as we can, as long as we can, do or die, to the last man type of deal? What do you think?
It's more like a spectrum. And it changes on where you are. Like there, for example, some people would think if you're Western Ukraine, like the stereotype is you're Western Ukrainian, you're the person who's like, yeah, ruhu ra war. Or if you're in the Donetsk, you're like on the other side of the spectrum because you have seen the worst throes of the war. But sometimes I'll find the exact opposite, where there'll be some people from Western Ukraine who are like, I don't give a fuck about Donetsk. Like it's like this, like all the way over there. And on the other side, I'll find people who are in Kramatorsk who have had to leave their homes 3 times during the last 12 years, who have set up their families for the 3rd time in Kramatorsk, which is now the de facto capital of unoccupied Donetsk. And they don't want to move again. They have no interest in moving again. And any deal that would see the rest of Donetsk given up, and for some people, any deal that would see occupied Donetsk officially given up is not tenable. From what the general public, if you were to look at the broad swath of information, what the general public seems to be of the position of is that they're not willing to give up anything that Russia hasn't taken, and they're not willing to officially recognize the annexation or occupation of everything that's in territory, and that they would be willing to do basically some amount of, look, we'll make a deal where you give us back some unoccupied territory, and then therefore we'll have to make peace with it, i.e. Zaporizhia, Mariupol. They feel that if they're getting some of their land back, then maybe they can make peace with it. If they can get some of their people who have been displaced back, then maybe they can make peace with it. They give something, they get something. For example, if you recognize the Russian language in some official capacity, or you make all these concessions to the Russians, the way negotiations go in the Ukrainian mindset is you get something in return. And they simply, from all the proposals put forward by the Russians, don't get anything really in return. And even when you talk about the one thing, the EU thing that Lactoid mentioned, which is, at least if that's true, which we really don't know, but if it's true, it is something of note. That's also an economic union that multiple members inside of it doesn't even agree that Ukraine should be inside of it. So even if Russia was to give it the thumbs up, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to go forward. I hope it would. Or Russia couldn't just go back on its word. Definitely if, again, it's a ceasefire and it breaks down in 6 months and says, look, it failed. Obviously, they're too Western. This is the problem. It's not like Putin's beliefs have changed fundamentally. His essays are publicly available. People can go read them. As for I do want to just say that, like, the early 3-week deal, the deal that was offered by the Russians 3 weeks into the war, I hear Hassan mention this. I hear other people mention this sometimes, like creators online, as this idea that Boris Johnson went in and tried to, like, basically bully the Ukrainians into not accepting peace and continuing to fight and stay on. But the big thing that ended it was the disarming clause. It wasn't even necessarily like neutrality status, right? Neutrality status is technically already in the Ukrainian constitution. So that being the big stopper is not even necessarily the case when stacked with the odds of a full-fledged Russian invasion. The big stopper, again, was disarming. The Ukrainians see an army invade them twice in 12 years while lying about it multiple times, and they're just not going to take the argument of, how about you give us your gun and we won't come back a third time now that you've given us real trouble. So that, I just don't think the offer early on was ever feasible. I don't think the Russians have ever offered a feasible peace deal or ceasefire deal.
What a...
Could I say a couple things?
You can, and then I have a broader question for everyone here, but go ahead.
Okay, very briefly. So regarding the Minsk II agreement that I was just chatting with Lonerbox about, there is a section that he was referring to right here, section 10, pull out of all foreign armed formations, military equipment, and also mercenaries from the territory of Ukraine under OSCE supervision, disarmament of all illegal groups. So, I mean, fair enough. My concern with this is when it says foreign armed formations and military equipment. Western forces were supplying Ukraine with military equipment as early as 2014 as well. And I'm not going to deny that the Russians were sending military equipment into the Donetsk People's Republic and the
and soldiers and tanks and just Russian, like the Russian army invaded.
No, so this is like I think a contentious point. I think we disagree on this. My understanding of the situation is that the primary aid that Russia was providing to the people there was in the form of military equipment and advisors. And surely that happened. I think America was doing the exact same thing for Ukraine in 2014. There's been a shift in language. Initially, this is what Ukraine acknowledged. If you go back and look at earlier sources, since the 2022 invasion, they have shifted the argument to say that, well, Russia's actually been invading us since 2014, and this is really just like a conventional land war. Russia just sent in a bunch of troops. Given the fact that we do have those polls that Lonerbox was mentioning, showing that most people in those areas, specifically the areas that are the DPR and the LPR, wanted increased autonomy from Kiev, that this happened in direct response to Euromaidan, and the Ukrainian quote-unquote counter-terrorist operation that launched attacks, and the fact that most of the civilian deaths that were occurring were happening in these areas. It's not surprising that the people here would be sort of galvanized against Kievian rule at this point, and why they would want to have their own elections, why they want to have their own autonomy. The Russians, of course, helped with that, but I reject this assertion that actually this is just like a conventional Russian invasion, as opposed to a sort of
I didn't say
it
was a conventional invasion. I said the Russian army invaded. I mean, it's not like rebels can just spawn T-90 tanks out of existence, and it's also not like rebels can instantly learn tank knowledge out of nowhere. It's not like they can know how to command all these different systems immediately, when a lot of the early rebels, to be quite frank, are people who would really just know how to man small arms. Where did they get the training? Where did they go to train? Who trained them? When you say military advisors, that also extends to military trainers. And again, there is plenty of photographic evidence showing equipment that can only be owned by the Russian armed forces, as well as people in Russian military fatigue with the flag patch removed, intervening at key points in the war where the front line changed significantly. There was a period where Donetsk city looked like it was going to be taken back by the Ukrainian armed forces. That period was short-lived, though, as a massive offensive was launched with resources and forces that were outside of the capacity of the rebels by themselves. I'm not saying that there aren't anybody in the Donetsk region who are, pro rah, like we want to separate, but it on its own, even when it just comes to personnel, could never hold back the Ukrainian armed forces. It's just like, as we can see, even if you're given all the equipment in the world, if you don't have the personnel to hold the position, I know that's a position you hold, Lactoid, then it's pointless. And so I want to have an explanation as to why Donetsk City was about to fall, and then the situation changed so rapidly when a mass of these troops with modern Russian equipment, who all knew how to use them, started appearing across the battlefield and encircling Ukrainian military formations. So all I'm putting forward is that our level of involvement is a little different than the Russian level of involvement. And from the Ukrainian perspective, this has been a continuation of Russian invasions for the last 12 years.
Okay. So I know that's kind of what the narrative has shifted to. This wasn't the case for between 2014 and 2022. I don't think anything you've said is contradictory to what I've said. I had never at any point doubted that the Russians were involved in sending advisors and equipment, and the level of equipment that they were sending I don't think that they sent any kind of significant contingent of soldiers to fight in the front line. I think that what it was they would send advisors, large amounts of military equipment. There were periods that this got larger. So, for example, there was there was a period where they had all these trucks that they were saying, we got to get in humanitarian aid. And there's some argument here that there is humanitarian aid associated with that, given the fact that the quality of life in these areas was so bad because of the cluster attacks and. Real quick, because of the cluster attacks and everything. But it's also probably obvious that the Russians were using this to sneak in military aid into those areas as well. That wouldn't surprise me whatsoever.
Am I fucking mental, or did Putin not 1 year after Minsk II failed admit that there were Russian personnel going into Ukraine to resolve issues in Donbass?
It was after Russian
military trainers, and advisors.
It was after Russian special forces were captured in 2015.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. Military personnel in the form of trainers, advisors.
And advisors. You don't think any of them took a shot at the Ukrainians?
It's possible. I'm not saying that's impossible. I'm saying that when we're looking at the conflict in terms of substantially complying with Minsk II, both sides are technically in violation of 10 of segment 10 of the agreement, where they are, Ukraine's not giving up its Western foreign equipment and the advisors that they're having train their military, and the LPR and the DPR aren't doing that either. And there's going to be varying levels of support that both sides are giving them. Now, one side, though, I think is actually more in line with the democratic will of the people living there, which is that, hey, we want the people of Donetsk and Luhansk, who wanted to have their own elections, who wanted to have their own form of government.
Why do you say that? You keep saying that. Why do you say this
autonomous
so authoritatively? Definitely now.
There's
we're talking it post 2022.
There's Western pollsters. Western pollsters, Zoyce from Berlin, did run a series of polls, and that was the number one answer, which was, we want to have autonomy from Kiev. We want to be able to have our own elections, and Kiev denied them the right to have their own elections.
I'll let this go a little bit. I'll let you guys respond, but
I just want to be blunt when it comes to Occupied Donetsk. Occupied Donetsk is a shithole. There's areas where you have no plumbing, so people throw plastic bags of shit out of the window. Plumbing doesn't work. They have to do water deliveries that are not always on time. You could get arrested for the most mild of critique of the government. The demographics are fucked. You don't think that you can get arrested for the most mild critique of the government?
No, I just think it's a little bit hypocritical. I think it's a little bit hypocritical, but keep going.
Well, Trump might arrest me, but that's not really relevant.
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the law that Zelensky signed, where it allows them to arrest people who are critical of Ukraine during the war.
Hey, do you think Putin would have allowed protests to break martial law and make him back off of his legislation to make it easier to be corrupt? Do you think that Putin would have backed down in the middle of the night? Because what I remembered him doing was the anti-war protesters were sent to draft offices. So I do think there's a significant. I
have no doubt that Russia also clamps down on freedom of speech and freedom of expression and freedom of protest.
You need to acknowledge that significant difference.
Ukraine also takes people. We've already talked about this. Ukraine will also take people who are critical of the war effort. People will take people who are critical of Ukraine's war effort reports of torture and death.
Zelensky can suck both of my nuts. I'm going to go back there in a month. There's tons of people criticizing Zelensky, ton of people criticizing Yarmak, ton of people criticizing Syrskyi as a butcher, ton of people critiquing the Ukrainian government. And in Ukraine, and as in the United States, war bloggers are not easily arrested. But in Russia, that's a lot more common. Even their guys, when they get a little too testy, like Gherkin and the other ones. But like, look, I just think there has to be an acknowledgement of significant difference here, that not all democracies are the same. Abraham Lincoln was a little bit of a tyrant, but that's a big difference between, one force and the other force when it came to the democratic principles. Since one force, ended up, wanting to own people, the other one didn't. There's some certain principles held by two forces that I feel like should be acknowledged. Lactoid, like if you were to say, look, it's not our business, that's one thing, but Ukraine is much more democratic than Russia.
No. So I simultaneously hold the position that it's not our business. That's fair. But I think certain things can become our business if like the humanitarian or pragmatic concerns get high enough. When it comes to this situation, I think you can probably point to like specific clauses in which Russia is worse than Ukraine, but I think you can also point to specific clauses in which like Ukraine is worse than Russia.
Okay, what clause is that?
Right off the top of my head, Putin is undeniably popular amongst his people, and he just had an election in accordance with the Russian constitution. Zelensky, on the other hand, despite the constitution of Ukraine mandating an election every 5 years, does not have an election.
Do you believe
he is currently not a legitimate president under their own constitution? That's important when we're talking about who's like a more democratic force.
So
not having an election when the Constitution tells you to.
Do you think
this is the only thing?
And speaking of Lincoln,
in reference.
I can bring up other things too. I got like a whole list of shit that Ukraine's doing.
Let's give it to Dylan to counter that. Go ahead.
I mean, I would say that an election in and of itself does not matter. An election has to be free and fair to matter. If it's not free and fair, then Bashar al-Assad was the democratic leader, elected the leader of Syria like 5 times in a row. So yes, Putin's popular. So is Zelensky. Zelensky still polls overwhelmingly popular with the Ukrainian public, and in most polling matchups, he still wins in a head-to-head election. I understand what you've said about the Ukrainian constitution. I also understand that, there is a mechanism by which in the Ukrainian constitution that the terms of the Rada can be extended. And there is a mechanism within the Electoral Commission.
Not the president.
You didn't let me finish my sentence. And there is a means within the Electoral Commission by which they can extend the term of the president. The opposition does not want a presidential election or Rada election right now. The Ukrainian people, when polled, do not want an election right now due to a variety of reasons. And I can understand saying I wanted an election anyway, but I will not accept that because Ukraine's going to wait till after the war to have an actually free and fair election, as what happened in 2019 when Poroshenko democratically handed power over to Zelensky. That's going to happen when the election is over. when the war is over. That's not going to happen over in Russia. There's if you run against the Russian establishment and you actually go out there and start talking about, the Russian corruption, you start talking about what's going on in Ukraine. If you are a real threat to the power, you could just get shot. And, back in Ukraine in the early 2000s, they used to do that to journalists and stuff too. And there's still like problems with like corruption in Ukraine, but you have to acknowledge the Gulf here,
journalists.
or we're not on the same level. Or we're just not on the same level. We're on 2 totally different planets. If you can't acknowledge that Ukraine is a much more developed civil society than Russia, and that if they were occupied, that civil society would cease to exist.
Okay, so I agree that both are inferior to American civil society, but I do reject this notion that it's like obvious that Ukraine is better. You brought up Abraham Lincoln, and I think that's an interesting example to bring up because we had an election in the United States during our Civil War.
I'll let you finish, but I do want to get back to the summit.
Sure. We had an election during our Civil War when half the country, the entire South, was occupied by Confederates, right?
What type of drones did the rebels use in that war?
Hold up 1 second. So when you're talking about, the only kind of election that's important is a free and fair election. And if we're referring to free and fair as you can't have an election if we're under some kind of conflict or if part of the country is occupied, I don't think that's true. I think that even a flawed election is better than no election. I think that, if we're going to appeal to polls, which, I mean, normally you guys shit on me for appealing to polls when it comes to like Crimeans or the Donbass. But if we're going to appeal to polls and say, well, this is what the Ukrainian people want, they don't want to have an election, then you should also just as easily be able to have a election under similar circumstances, perhaps mail-in ballots, figure some way to do it in a way that would be better than what the current situation is that they're not having an election at all. And I'm going to tie this back to the summit, okay? The reason why this is important is because going back to something you said earlier, Dylan, you're right in that, I don't know, let's say there was an election and Zelensky won, in the election. I don't necessarily know how much of an effect this would have on Ukraine's position and whether or not that could like resolve any kind of disagreement between the Verkhovna Rada and Zelensky. But what it would do is it would, I think, give much stronger credence.
What disagreement between the Rada and Zelensky?
The potential disagreement. I'm telling no, you're missing the point. I'm saying going back, the potential disagreement if Zelensky's okay with some kind of land deal and the Verkhovna Rada does not approve it under their constitution, right? Mm-hmm. And so in that event, you had asked me earlier if Zelensky had an election, would that potentially change the scenario on the ground? I think one thing that it would do is it would give the Russians some level of reassurance that like a potential avenue for trying to disclaim the results of the treaty later on is going to be closed, right? Because I could see the argument coming up, which is like, currently Zelensky's in power in blatant disregard of their constitution. The election commission, whatever rule they want to promulgate, doesn't take precedence over the constitution of Ukraine, which is listed as the supreme law of the land. And the supreme law of the land has I think Article 83 has a specific clause that allows the terms of parliamentarians to be extended during martial law. But it's very specifically 84, sure. It was 83.
No, paragraph
84.
4 of Section 83, Article 83, paragraph 4. But go ahead.
Okay, so I was right. So there is a specific, but it specifically does not mention the president, right? And so then the question arises, well, is there anything in the Constitution that gives the president this ability? There's not.
Not in the Constitution. It is in the Electoral Commission, though.
But the Electoral Commission, their rulings. This is like con law like 101. In the U.S., if Congress passes a law, it can't go over the Constitution. The Constitution, it's Article I think 101. I could be wrong on that. It's in the early hundreds. Specifies that the president will serve a term of 5 years. That is the term. And so the fact that they're not having an election is in blatant disregard of their own constitution. Now, the Russians are maybe concerned that let's say that happens. Let's say they come to some kind of deal and with Zelensky. Well, later on down the road, Ukraine doesn't like the deal anymore. And they say, well, actually, that deal was made with an illegitimate president. We can't abide by that deal. That's not, we can only abide by presidents that are constitutionally elected in our government. Well, now what? I mean, technically they're right, but at the time, the Ukrainians, government was refusing to have an election. So what do? I don't know.
I do want to.
Well, what you could do really is just stop this fucking weird pretense of just being the first war ever where anyone has thought there's like a serious concern about a country not having elections while they're being invaded. Like no one has ever made this complaint. No one ever. I've heard a few people say like Hitler had more democratic mandate than Churchill, I guess, because Churchill never had an election before he became prime minister in World War II, and there were no elections until the war ended. But mostly those people are kind of like arguing in bad faith. I don't understand what this both sides is between Zelensky and Putin, who literally has to deal with fucking nationwide protests about electoral fraud when he wins elections, who had to change his own constitution in Russia to keep running for president. What is this? What are we doing?
So you can act incredulous all you want, but that was done legally, firstly. You might dislike it. You might dislike the fact that Putin, like by Western polls, has like an over 85% approval rating or something crazy like that. He is overwhelmingly popular within his country, and he did have elections in accordance with the Constitution and won. Now, you can point to other specific things and say, well, like Russia does this worse. And I can point to certain things. Ukraine does this worse. It's not just the election. It's also the language bans. It's also the religion bans.
The language bans is worse? Really?
Yes,
let's oh, God.
Wick, hold on.
Wick,
there is no...
Wick, I gotta... You said we got to get back to the main topic. But if we go off on this, because this is important if he says this, will we have enough time to
That's why I'm allowing this, because,
Okay, I just want to make sure we had enough time.
You can you can, if he says something, or even any of you, if any of you say something that the other person feels a need that they have to respond to, we'll allow it, because so much of this is interconnected, right? I will just say this. The question I want to ask is, like, what position or what role should the American government be playing in the negotiations here, regardless of what we think is going to happen? So I want you to keep that in your mind, but I'll allow it for the sake of the discussion. Finish up what you were saying, Lactoid, and then I'll let Dylan and Loner respond, and we can figure it out. Go ahead.
Sure. So not only, and when I refer to language bans,
language bans, frankly.
Yeah, well, because they're going to be responsive to this. Sure. I was having a grand old time watching a Lonerbox video earlier before this debate, and Lonerbox agreed that the 2019 language law was pretty bad. He conceded that was pretty bad. I hope that's still his opinion. Since then, that was, of course, before the invasion. Since then, it
wasn't a language ban. It's not actually a language ban.
Well, you didn't call it a ban. You called it a language. That's why I said language law, in which it specifically prioritizes Ukrainian, and it puts Ukrainian restrictions on media that, a certain percentage has to be in Ukrainian, and that certain minority languages are protected, with the notable exception of Russian, despite the fact that Russian is a widely spoken minority language in Ukraine. And the bans really started coming into effect after the war. I agree with that. But it's really gotten worse since the 2019 language law. Now you're seeing, like in Kiev, for example, when they're banning a Russian cultural language product, books, they're banning books that are in Russian, and they're banning I forget if the Russian Orthodox Church or the Orthodox Church in Russia. I know one of them is sanctioned by the Ukrainian government. The other one's not. The canonical one's not. And so they are banned, right? A certain religion. I mean, very similar to, like, if we were to ban some kind of sect of the Catholic Church in America. Pretty, I think, horrific. And you can say, like, well, this is no big deal. But I think if we're going to make appeals to, like, things like ethnic cleansing or like cultural destruction, I think that, like, restricting language and religion and culture is a problem. And those laws, at least on the books, are not present in Russia. They're simply not, and they
because they don't need to be. Like, again, because I guess what you missed out from my video.
They need to be in Ukraine.
Yes, and you should have noticed if you watched my video that European human rights bodies agreed that there was justification for Ukraine, even though there are issues with the specifics of the law. That there was a justification for this country that has been under the thumb of Russian imperialism for over 300 years, where they have actually had the Ukrainian language banned and Ukrainian writers murdered and people suppressed and education systems overturned and people replaced by Russians so they could Russify the population. That in that context, it does make sense to want to promote your own national language, and that sometimes that will mean people who speak the Russian language like feeling sidelined, even if it's just the case that, like, they have to dub certain media in Ukrainian, or if you print a Russian newspaper, you got to print it in Ukrainian alongside it. Do you disagree that there's a principle there that Russia doesn't really have to deal with for the same reason?
I disagree with the principle generally. Like, I think that whether or not Russia has to deal with it, which I'm not necessarily sure is the case, because Russia does have large groups of ethnic minorities, especially like in the South Caucasus, and these areas generally have like rights to speak their language, but. So I don't think that you're saying that, like,
it's not about having minorities in the country. It's about the fact that you are literally just coming out of hundreds of years of your culture.
Well, that was the second point that I'm going to get to. The first point is like, well, Russia doesn't have to, like, Russia's not in the same situation. I think on one hand they are, because there are like large groups of minorities that have like independent cultures and unique cultures, and those languages aren't banned in the same way. But then when you're talking about like the sort of, and I'm going to use this word directly because this is really what I think your argument hinges on. This sort of like land back reparations mentality of like, well, for hundreds of years, we were unfairly treated, which I'm not going to deny, right? Stalin was evil. For hundreds of years, we were unfairly treated. So now we're going to unfairly treat them, right? Now we're going to get back at them, and now we're going to oppress their culture so we can reinvigorate ours because the Ukrainian blood is tied to the Ukrainian soil. That's really concerning. And I think that's where a lot of the claims of like fascism come, because I mean, this is a lot of the sort of mentality, which is like, well, we have to bring up a resurgence of our culture, even if that involves stomping on the cultural rights of our citizens, right? They're Ukrainian citizens who speak Russian, who now can't They can't buy Russian books. They can't listen to Russian music in public. Then they're Ukrainian citizens that speak Russian.
Again,
what about them?
Conflating pre-2022 invasion and after is kind of thing I want to maybe avoid here, because first of all, give you one example then. Do you think that if they said that civil servants have to answer the phone in Ukrainian, but they can switch to Russian if the caller wants to, is that repressing Russians?
I mean, that specific one, they have to answer in Ukrainian, but they can switch if the caller wants to.
Morally corrupt.
I mean, if it might be like a slight repression if like the.
Thank you for all the subs. Appreciate all the support everyone's dropping. Thank you.
But it would be like a pretty slight repression. I would agree.
Burns is an immoral.
Okay, I feel like when a lot of countries have either overcome imperialism or have not even done that, you can say like France, like when nations form, like the idea of coalescing around a national identity and promoting a national language is not really that unusual. That's why some of these laws, which you call slight repressions, were not seen as slight repressions by the Europeans. There were some measures that were seen as a lot less necessary, but that was Zelensky's position before 2022.
Burns is
So
immoral.
I don't call it, but you did say language ban earlier. That's why.
No, you can roll back. What I said was the 2019 language law. I did not call it a ban prior to the war. And then I very specifically said, yes, it's true that the bans really started coming after the 2022 invasion. I was very clear about that. Yes, the bans, the actual like criminal enforcement of these, of restricting people from having, books and speaking and music and all these things, that started coming in 2022 and 2023. I'm not saying that happened before the 2022 invasion, but you still see like a sort of, again, like prioritization of like Ukrainian identity, which of course is going to be unpopular again amongst the separatists in the East, like in the DPR and LPR. I mean, what kind of messages to send to them of like, oh, we want to bring you back into this country by force, by the way. Oh, and by the way, we also passed this law in which the language that you speak at home is no longer, going to be favored in your area. It's no longer going to be the language of your community. Okay. I think that's kind of messed up.
I want to give it to well, you can respond if you like, Lonerbox, but then Dylan had some things to say on it that he wanted to tackle as well. So go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to do, just before we forget about it, going back to, first of all, there were Russian regular soldiers in Ukraine, even from 2014 and as early as February. One of the first battles, actually, the Russians took back like 150 coffins of their own soldiers who were fighting right from the get-go. So that's just, there were actually regular fighters there as well. It wasn't just advisors. Second of all, when you were talking about Minsk and both sides violating by not withdrawing their forces from either side, do you think this is an equivalent? The fact, bearing in mind, Russia didn't even admit that they had soldiers in the country. So they were like, well, how, we agree to this, but we're not going to take anyone out because we don't have anyone in there. Like, do you think these are equal violations? The Americans and Russians not pulling out of Ukraine and Minsk too?
Well, part of the issue is I don't actually know, and you don't know. I mean, you mentioned, I guess, some story about 150 coffins. I don't know where that comes from.
From a Russian opposition politician.
Okay, all right. So sure. So some politician said that. Even if that is the case, which I'm skeptical of, but even if that is the case, I mean, you can't tell me what percentage that is of the total fighters. You can't tell me what amount of equipment was being sent by Russia into the DPR and LPR, and you also can't tell me what type of equipment or how much equipment was being sent into Ukraine by Western powers starting in 2014. I don't know on subsection 10. I don't know.
Sorry. No, I'm not accepting. You're not getting away with that.
Absolutely.
You're not getting away with that. I also can't tell you how many Wehrmacht tanks were in Poland. I can still say they should withdraw. And if they said, oh, we should get allies out the other side if there are any there, then that's not. I'm asking you if you think it's an equal violation for Russia, the force that's in there, even if they have 100 soldiers or 150 or 200 or 3,000 versus Americans who are helping Ukraine that has foreign forces in their country. So do you think these are equal violations when Russia's like admitting they have soldiers there?
Okay, I think you maybe you misunderstood what I was saying. My answer was, I don't know the gravity of the violation of subsection 10 because I don't know the full extent of involvement, and you don't either, of either side when it comes to the involvement of Russia and the DPR and America in Ukraine generally. Now, I agree that both sides were absolutely involved. When Russia says like, oh, we have nothing there, I mean, that's not true, right? There's obviously going to be Russian equipment there and advisors and all sorts of stuff, and
Special
same thing,
forces.
vice versa. So you're gonna have, you Western equipment, which again, all of this violates subsection 10. When you are asking me, well, what's a clear, like which side is like more clearly violating this? I don't know. But what I do know, okay, and I think now that we've established that subsection 10, at least in my opinion, I don't know who's violating it more, but both sides are violating it. What I do know is that when you have an area, okay, where the people there want self-determination, they want to be autonomous, there's only one side that's violating them in this case, and that's Ukraine. So you keep referring to it as like the foreign entity coming in to our country. No, you surrender your legitimacy over the LPR and DPR of being your country when you coup your president. It's over. You don't get to claim those areas anymore if they want to leave.
What? According to what rules? What are you talking about? First, okay, wait, hang on. There again. So I'm not talking about numbers. I'm talking about the fact that, as far as I know, I don't know if American soldiers were like in battles and dying in any report.
I don't know either.
Are you pretending that we've been that America was hiding 100 dead soldiers?
I don't know if mercenaries were there. I don't know if mercenaries are there, and that's also covered under subsection 10.
Okay, let's say there were 10 times more Americans, but Putin is the one saying, we don't even have any soldiers there. Sorry. Then he admits it a year later that they actually did.
Sure, that's a lie.
Okay.
How do you negotiate with somebody who doesn't agree he's doing the thing he agreed not to do? How do you even begin to negotiate with that person?
I'm not asking you quantitatively. I'm asking you qualitatively which violation is worse. Russia has no right to be there with soldiers who are getting involved in battles to help a secessionist movement.
Well, when you say no right, I think they have a moral right to do that, firstly. So I guess it depends what you mean by right. And in terms of, let's say, 10 times more Americans were there, I don't think that subsection 10's violation is dependent on whether or not the foreign head of state lies or not about troops or mercenaries being in those areas. The only thing that subsection 10 talks about is mercenaries, foreign equipment, and foreign militaries being in these areas. That's all subsection 10 is referring to. So if you're saying, well, look, Putin wasn't fully honest in the fact that he totally fucking lied about like what kind of assets that he was sending into the LPR and DPR, the answer to that is sure, he was lying. And what does that have to do with subsection 10? The fact that he was lying. What does the fact that he was lying have to do with subsection 10?
Means that negotiations were doomed from the start because he was never going to engage in good faith and actually pulled them out because he never was interested in it.
The Ukrainians never pulled out any of their foreign weaponry. They never even tried.
Okay, let's do this. You're the Ukrainians.
Did
right?
they?
You're engaging in good faith as the Ukrainians. Let's just do this for a 30-second exercise. You're engaging good faith. You really want to end the war. And we just signed Minsk 2. We're talking about Article 10. I'm the Russians. Come to me and let's do this. Let's get each other to cooperate, because only if I cooperate will you cooperate, right? If I follow everything and you follow nothing, then I won't, then obviously that's a problem. So let's try that.
Yeah, I would take all of the foreign weaponry that I received and start to move it like away and try to like get it to leave the country.
Fantastic.
And if I see,
when you have the other side not even acknowledging that their troops are still there in the front line.
Yeah. If I see like on the other side, like I'm not seeing some kind of like concurrent movement based on my intelligence, then I might start to accuse them of saying, hey, you said you were going to pull this shit out and you didn't. And then try to make some kind of diplomatic situation about it.
That's
but of course, but of course, no, they didn't make any effort to pull out.
They have their soldiers there, so we're not going to withdraw. That's what they said.
Did the Ukrainians make any effort to withdraw the foreign weaponry? Can I finish a sentence, please? Did the Ukrainians make any effort to pull the foreign weaponry that they received from the West out of the country, but prior to refusing elections in the DPR and LPR?
Yeah, probably not, because they had Russian soldiers who were on the other side who weren't leaving and weren't even acknowledging that they were there. Yeah, of course. It's not like, I don't know what this childish interpretation is where like you've got like a conflict ongoing and a front line and you're just like, oh, well, we're just going to lower all our defenses and fuck off and just be like, listen, I hope you guys do the same thing. Like that's not practical. That's not a practical thing to do.
So can I respond to that? Not all of their forces were mercenaries or foreign supplied military equipment. They had like indigenous military equipment and soldiers as well. So they wouldn't have to pull back everything. I agree they would have had less of an advantage, but your argument could work for the other side as well, right? The DPR and LPR is looking and they're seeing that the Ukrainians are not getting rid of all their foreign, Western military equipment. Well, then why the fuck should we? Why should
Well,
we
you're talking about
send
the
it, like,
Russians, not the people, not the average Ukrainian.
Well,
I
I know that you would prefer that to be the case, but the reality is, like, the people from the polls, the people in the DPR and the LPR
they wanted autonomy, not Russian force to take the territory back from them. That's not what they wanted.
Because we have so many things to cover that we
Minsk 2 guaranteed autonomy and local elections in those areas. And when they tried to have those local elections, who stopped them? It wasn't the Russians, it was the Ukrainians.
Okay, so there are people in Catalonia who want to have an independence referendum. Does that mean a foreign force can come in there with mercenaries to help them secede?
In the event that the Spanish government is illegally couped, the people of Catalonia should be able to declare independence, and they should be able to get support from a foreign entity. Yes.
Well, in this case, the Spanish government has just gotten rid of the French puppet leader who is breaking like every promise that he's made to the entire population, and then using police officers to fire on protesters who oppose him. Yeah, that's happening. And then the French are going to come in to save Catalonia afterwards.
So I'm going to do two things.
Fuck me.
I'm sure you've created this fucking straw man, and now you're just like dousing gasoline on it, and now you're acting like you just won something. Okay, I'm going to address everything you just said because it's completely false, as in terms of an allegory to what's going on or what happened in Ukraine during Euromaidan. Can I please, Wick?
Yeah, finish. But
yes,
there's so much.
Yeah, it is the course of the conversation. It is the course of the conversation. So. I think, yes. So to answer the question that you asked me directly, yes, if the Spanish government is unconstitutionally couped, Catalonia should be able to declare independence. And I would also say that this could also happen if a area of a country is like sufficiently disenfranchised. So America, we declared independence from the UK, and we got help from the French and the Spanish to do so. And I think that was fine because the UK denied us representation in their parliament. Now when you say you mischaracterize Euromaidan as well, this is because the puppet president, of course, that was democratically elected in 2010. That election was overseen by thousands of international observers, and even the OSCE recognizes that was a free and fair election in which Yanukovych won. Nobody serious denies that, even on the Ukraine side these days.
Okay,
we're talking about like, that's true, and we're talking about like
it's not important.
Yeah, and he willingly used the consent of the people to go against a trade deal that had support from the overwhelming majority of the parliament. Yeah.
Here's the problem. Like, you're saying such horseshit, and then it takes like a long time to like disprove your horseshit, and then I go on too long and Wick stops me.
I let you go a lot. Okay.
Well, I know, but the problem is the truth is often complicated, and when you just spew shit, it's like it doesn't really. It's hard. It's difficult. I won't. Look, I won't be able to disprove this shit. I won't be able to talk about the length of the Euromaidan riots and the cops that were killed and the occupation of public buildings. I also won't be able to talk about the tripartite trade agreement that was proposed by Ukraine that was rejected by the EU. I won't be able to substantially debunk all of this bullshit in the length of time that we have on this panel. And that's just an unfortunate reality of, I guess, political debating. But Lonerbox is mischaracterizing the Euromaidan coup. The insurrectionists were not these sort of helpless victims. This is not what happened.
Okay. There are so many potential places to go from here. I do want to give it to Dylan for a moment to kind of maybe...
I'm going to try to blow through these things because I'm sure Wick, I can see it in his eyes from retired panel hosts to current panel host, the pain of needing to get back to what we're actually talking about because there's a big thing tomorrow. So first thing is, I would say like talking about the Minsk 2 failing and the Russians like, well, what troops? I don't know. Just pull out your troops, but we don't have troops to pull out. And whether or not if the Ukrainians pulled out while the Russians were denying they even had troops there in the first place, if the Russians would have said, hey, I guess we do have troops there and we are going to withdraw, whether they would have come out and do that. But ever since they invaded in 2022, the Russians have continued with the same demand. We want an army. We want a massive army. We want a massive army inside Ukraine, and you shouldn't have one. They want Ukraine to demilitarize. They made the demand at 3 weeks into this, and they've made the demand ever since. So it seems to be a consistent want of the Russians to get the Ukrainians to have less Western equipment, have less guns, bombs, tanks generally, while they get to maintain theirs by either denying they have it in the first place or just questioning the idea of them having to limit anything they have is ridiculous. So I would just say that maybe back in 2014, we could have lived in ambiguity, but we live in today in 2025, and we can see what the Russians have demanded since then, and that has continued Ukrainian demilitarization while they don't have to give anything up. Also, as for like the legitimacy of like if Zelensky had an election right now, you know, and Churchill had, if he was to do this right now, that could undermine the Russian claim of illegitimacy and stop a way that they could reignite the war. The Russians claimed that the Ukrainians had biological research laboratories that were going to target the DNA of Russians. They've claimed that Satanist trans people is doing X, Y, and Z. They claim that the Ukrainians did the Moscow Mall attack. They claim the Ukrainians invaded them in 2022, and actually that's why they invaded, and they released footage of Russian soldiers in Ukrainian garb crossing the border in territory that only the Russians could have occupied. So unless the Ukrainians somehow snuck around them and got the drop on them, like that just it isn't really. So I don't think that the Russians are going to need to be like, oh, we would invade Ukraine, but now Zelensky had an election, he seems so legitimate. I don't think that that's really going to be a significant factor. As for the language bans, in occupied territory, people are heard speaking Ukrainian. They see it as an insult, they see them as a potential threat, and they're disappeared. They're disappeared, and they can be tortured. They can be tortured. They can be sexually abused in these places. They can be beaten in these places very severely. I know entire Russian-speaking Ukrainian military units. I meet people on the front line serving in the Ukrainian armed forces who are speaking Russian. I like my main fixer in Ukraine, who's from displaced person, refugee from Donetsk. He speaks Russian all the time. I understand that I look at some of these like language restrictions of the books published. This percentage has to be Ukrainian and XYZ. And to me, as an American, you know, when we don't have a state enforced language, it seems pretty silly. But I also understand that the Ukrainian culture is in an existential struggle, and the Russians deny Ukrainians really exist as anything else than an extension of Russia. And so Ukraine is trying to assert its culture, as Russia has historically, in its past during the Russian Tsardom, banned it and are punishing people for practicing it. People get arrested for singing Ukrainian music, XYZ, happens all the time. So the idea that the Ukrainians are worse when it comes to the language ban, because when you walk into Ukrainian public building, they speak to you first in Ukrainian, in the country of Ukraine, I think it's a little ridiculous. As for the church ban, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, which you didn't seem to know which church was which, but we're going to be talking about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, not the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. We're talking about that's the Russian. We're going to say the Russian version, Ukrainian version. That's simplifying it, but I'm just to get around it. The head of that church, Kirill, said if you go to Ukraine and you kill Ukrainians, you go to heaven. Tons of these pastors have been used as spies, as informants. The Russians have used the Russian Orthodox Church to try to get inside the United States and play spies in churches in the U.S. And we're a country divided by an ocean. Ukraine's right there, a country they're actively invading, who also shares the Orthodox faith. So the Ukrainians felt that it was of a national security priority to support the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and to make it so that they had an entity that was not religiously dominant in the country, that is controlled, like this specific Russian Orthodox Church that's controlled by Russia. So I understand that, you know, maybe in the United States, people are uncomfortable with the idea of any like sect or any specific church being shut down, but Ukraine was being invaded. And the way they wrote the ban is, if you're invading us, if a country's invading us and a religious organization is based out of the capital of that country, then it cannot operate in Ukraine. Meaning that if Russia was to stop invading tomorrow, the Russian Orthodox Church would be unbanned overnight by the letter of the law on what is in Ukraine. So I don't think comparing that to an occupied territory where you're not allowed to operate a Protestant church, you're not allowed to operate Baptist churches. There was 40 Protestant churches in Metropole before the Russians took over. There's now none. I visited a lot of these churches that have been bombed. There was Pentecostals that were lynched in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions back in 2014, 2015. This is not a new trend, whether it was done by the Russian Orthodox Army or other far-right goons. So the idea that Ukraine is worse than Russia when Russia is cracking down heavily on these religious minorities and willing to use their religious entity as a weapon, therefore bringing it under their scrutiny that you're now criticizing it, I don't think those are good ways to say that, see, Ukraine in some ways are worse than Russia. Okay. Even if I have personal disagreements with parts of that. There's other stuff I could talk about, like him saying like the majority of people in Donetsk want to be part of Russia or want to be part of the DPR. That's, in my experience, it isn't true. Now, maybe, you know, he has a different experience than mine. And obviously I know that Wick wants to get back to the main topic. So for now, we'll put that on the shelf and we'll revisit it later.
I can address the things that are said, right, Wick?
Okay, I'm just going to throw a flag on the play, okay, because we have to talk about something other than the rehash of the same arguments that we've had since the war started.
Well, then let me just respond and then we can be done. I won't bring up any other points. I will just address the points that were made.
I'll respond after.
I hold on. I will not bring up any. I specifically will talk about the language ban, church ban, and the allegations of. In fact, I'll end on the allegations of Russia and then tie it back to the topic.
I'll bring up the kidnapping children next.
I'll tell you what. You can do that, Lactoid, if you remember the question I asked you to keep in mind.
I totally fucking forgot the question you asked.
That's why we have to get back to.
So I'm gonna wait. Let me just here. I will bring it back to the topic. I swear. So very briefly, I think it's. Again, disingenuous to say like, what's happening in Russian occupied areas, Donbass and Crimea and these areas. I know of these people that are disappeared or beaten, or there's these things that are happening, and so like this is much worse than the language bans that are happening in Ukraine. I'm obviously highly skeptical of just some sort of like anecdotal proposal of saying, hey, like I've heard it's worse over there. When we know
there's tons of investigations,
when we know
testimony.
Hold up,
I'm not just saying that I saw it myself. I'm not everywhere.
Sure. When we know that it is on the books, the law in Ukraine, and it's not in Russia.
How?
It is
on. Hold on, Lactoid. Just for my edification, how many people have been arrested for speaking Russian in Ukraine?
So I've looked into that. It's hard because a lot of the information coming out of Ukraine is censored right now. But I think it's like over one article I saw was like over 60 have been criminally charged with it. But that was like pretty early on. Like this was like a couple months after the ban's initiation. And a lot of this information is just not going to get out. A lot of this information is not going to be published because
zero. The number could be zero.
Well, no, it's not going to be zero. It's going to be more than zero.
How do you know it's not going to be zero?
Because we have early articles indicating that
people were criminally charged. But I asked how many people have been arrested.
Hold up. We have early reports before Zelensky signed his media ban, right, in which the government now very strictly controls the media coming out of Ukraine. That did indicate that there were people being punished under these bans. Now, I agree that since Zelensky signed the media ban,
by the way.
So Zelensky signed a media ban. I can bring up the details. Zelensky signed a media ban that was condemned by affiliates of the EU as being very
I'm familiar. What did it do?
Yeah, I'll bring up the full details. My understanding. Stop saying okay like you got some kind of win.
Well,
my understanding is that I do. I know generally that it allows the government
too, but you should know what it is. Okay,
I know that generally it allows the government to control what kind of media, or every media company has to be registered with the state in order to function within the country of Ukraine. And the government can pull the permission for any media company operating in Ukraine. That is generally what it does. There might be some extra specifics that have to go into that, but I think that is a sufficient understanding to condemn it.
Yeah, the reason I'm interrupting you, Lactoid, is because I do want to get, and I did tell you, I want to get back to the main topic.
And I said I was going to get to there, but Dylan went on a long rant, and I totally let him do it.
You went on a long rant first.
And then I let him, and now when I respond, now
we are equal. You went on a long rant, he went on a long rant.
Well, but we can't. You can't like, but you can't. But he makes a point, and then I don't answer within 2 seconds, and then I proceed within 4 seconds to give a full answer. You can't cut me off at the 2 seconds because then it looks like I'm dumb. But in reality, I very accurately described the problem with the media ban, which is that media organizations have to be registered with the government, and they can pull registration at their own whim. That's fucked. The church ban, you seem to be more just justifying it as opposed to denying it. I disagree that it's justified at all.
Okay.
I don't think that you get to ban a religion because
they didn't ban a religion. They didn't do that. They banned a church.
They hold on. Yes, this would be very similar to if the Pope, and by the way, the Pope condemned this law. It'd be similar if the Pope like, let's say there's some war between the U.S. and some Catholic country, and the Pope was like, "Oh, like America's in the bad. You shouldn't do that." And then our response is to like start banning Catholic churches because of their affiliation with Rome. No,
if the Vatican
I just disagree.
was
That's fucked.
invading and occupying 1/3 of the United States, the Pope said that if you go to America and you kill Americans, you go to heaven. And then he used Catholic churches in the United States to spy on Americans. And there was also separate Catholic churches you could go to anyway. And the situation would be vastly different.
So no, okay. The example that I gave was not the Vatican invading, because again,
I'm not
the
even
Vatican,
saying this is a good thing, by the way. All I'm saying is that this comparison between Ukraine and Russia is so shit, and you're going for straws.
Dylan, you can say, I know you have to put in that it's bad because truly it's undefensible. But the comparison I made was, what if a different Catholic country was at war with the U.S.? Now you say, well, let's say the Pope was saying, yeah, you can go kill Americans. But here's the thing. I would still be against that ban. Maybe I would monitor these churches like for foreign interference, but I'd be against the ban because the Catholic citizens of the U.S. have religious rights, and I don't get to say, well, you don't get to have religious rights because your religion, your religious structure, right, which is very important when we're talking about Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, disagrees with our position. I just disagree with you. I understand that you're trying to justify.
I'm going to go to Lonerbox
as a way. This is the point that brings it back.
Both of you. Okay.
This
Lactoid,
isn't comparable to shutting down all the churches and arresting Baptists.
We got it. I believe you guys. I wonderful. It's wonderful to see the fight, the vim, the vigor. Lonerbox.
That's a great word,
I have
vigor.
a question for you to maybe get us back and steer us back to a course, because there is a major summit happening tomorrow, which could potentially steer us on either a path to peace or just throw off peace altogether, or change America's stance to the war to be either far more pro-Ukraine or far more anti-Ukraine or pro-Russia even. So it's helpful and useful to talk about. Should Trump or any American leader be meeting with Putin or meeting with the Russian government without Ukrainian representatives there? Do you think that that's a good idea? Why or why not? Do you think it's maybe necessary perhaps to make to find out what one side wants without the other interfering? Like, what are your thoughts on here? I guess the question that I did ask that everyone forgot is, what role should the American government be taking in the peace process or the conflict resolution process that is going on?
I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with meeting separately with other leaders. Obviously, with countries that are at war, you probably sometimes have to have mediators that don't involve the two leaders being in the same room for kind of obvious reasons. But there's probably an issue with doing it in a capacity where you're taking where you're doing it in Alaska and also misspeaking and making Russian nationalists, like extremists, think that you might be wanting to suggest that Alaska actually is rightfully Russian. So that was a bit silly. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter in the sense that Putin, as far as I know, still does not want any security guarantees for Ukraine to ever be solidified in a way that would make it difficult for him to try again and catch more later. I don't think things have changed in the last couple of months since I last looked properly into this, but as far as I know, it seems like Russia has a bit of an advantage to keep the fighting going. So I feel like any demand they're going to make is going to be far too excessive for anyone to meaningfully go with. Trump, I guess it just depends on who was nicer to him in his last night's fucking dream on the day. I feel like his opinion is just completely contingent on whatever mood he just happens to be in that day.
Okay, same question to both of you then. What role or position should the American government, whether it be Trump or a representative or others, be taking in the conflict resolution peace process here? I guess to also add, as Lonerbox brought up, does Putin even actually want peace in this instance? And what has he done to signal that, if anything? Go ahead. I'll let Dylan go first, and we'll let Lactoid go. So Lactoid can have the last word, quote unquote, right, if he wants.
It's not going to happen.
Okay, so let me just say, everything Lactoid's going to say after me is a lie, but he's going to wait to talk after me because he's a scum. I just want to quickly declare that. And if he responds to me in any way, he's gay. Anyway, the leak. I don't think anything will matter until the structures are in place to stop another war. My problem with just
What
hand
are
over this
that?
little,
Just real quick, what are the structures in place to stop the other war? Can you elaborate on that? What does
an
that mean?
example of that would be is some amount of mutual defense pact that would make another war so catastrophic in conception that it wouldn't be possible. The same thing that had Soviet and American tanks facing down in Berlin, but made us say it's not worth it, you know? Now, it doesn't have to be atomic Armageddon. It could just be a quagmire of all quagmires. It could be any number of conceptions. One thing, of course, NATO membership is the one that everyone talks about. It also doesn't need to necessarily be NATO membership. It could be a multilateral defense pact between the United States, the United Kingdom, and some other sympathetic nations with Ukraine, under the idea that if they were invaded again, there would be troops on the ground, or some amount of response that would make it so overwhelming for the Russians that they wouldn't invade again. And I imagine the Russians would try to find some guarantee that Ukraine would not invade them again. Remember that time they did? I forget that. I missed the headlines, but just to make sure that they don't do that again. But they until there's structures that will stop the Russians from taking the opportunity, even if we somehow convince Putin that this is the end of this war, Putin's not the only Russian hardcore nationalist. In fact, Putin's not even necessarily the most extreme Russian nationalist. And so the idea that Putin dies and was replaced by somebody who, with such a, let's just say, centric model with all the power structures revolving around one person, he's going to be a little nervous about showing weakness, and then he might take the advantage to relaunch the war. It should be that no matter who's in that seat, relaunching the war would be a catastrophe. And I think that by making Ukraine neutral and then not placing anything else there to stop another invasion, all you're doing is leaving that possibility up to chance. And I think that is just passing the war down to another generation. Not only another generation of Ukrainians and Russians and Europeans, but also another generation of humans who are going to be having to live in the background of a possible showdown between atomic powers in between.
All right, I'm going to give all my wrong takes. So unfortunately, one of them actually agrees with something Lonerbox said. So I guess we're both wrong, which is that there is nothing inherently wrong with meeting separately. I think that's totally reasonable given the situation. I think that, we absolutely have our heads in the sand if we're going to pretend that like America isn't directly invested in this. I mean, we've given a boatload of money and there's an influence question as well, obviously, right? We sort of see Ukraine as a kind of budding potential sphere of influence member. And that's going to really, I think, be the reason why it makes sense for America to have this conversation with Russia. I think it's honestly more important for America to have this conversation with Russia than just simply a meeting between Ukraine and Russia, because the real question on what this will end up on has to do with what America's reaction is going to be, because that's going to dictate what Ukraine can or can't do. Without American support, Ukraine is simply not going to be able to continue this war, especially how things are going. Right? Support for the war in Ukraine has absolutely plummeted. There's been new polling out, right, in which the support for the war has dropped down to 20 percentages, since being up from the 70 percentages the beginning of the war. So, and this probably has to do with the fact that 75% of its military is currently conscripts drafted into the conflict. It's generally, this is bad for morale and enthusiasm. And so they're looking for peace, but I also agree that the demands are going to be relatively hefty. And I think in many ways fair, but hefty, to a point where a government's going to have to explain to the more hardline factions of its people why they have to give territory over, why they have to agree to never join NATO. And then specifically addressing the NATO part, I mean, I understand there's still this dream of like, well, we can get Ukraine into NATO or some kind of multi-force defense pact or something along those lines. I mean, this to me actually is my position right now is, I think, and I'm willing to be corrected. I don't think I would dislike seeing that outcome. I think it'd be like, having those areas go over to Russia and then have the remainder of Ukraine kind of become our sort of EU puppet state. I think that would be, kind of good for me as an American. But it's sort of just like this fantasy, right? The Russians have made it clear that this is really, I think, one of the main thrusts of the war, even more so than territorial acquisition, because again, that initial peace deal that was presented didn't it didn't make territorial acquisition clear at first. Or at all, sorry. Instead, what it said was, you can't join NATO and your military is too big, right? We're concerned about the threat that you pose by existing as you do. So this idea that like we're going to tell a country that's winning the war, actually, like, yeah, they're going to, do the main thing that you don't want them to do, and the reason why this war really happened in the first place. I mean, good luck. I mean, it's just not going to happen.
Responses. Thoughts?
Again, it doesn't necessarily need to be NATO. It could be a unilateral or multilateral defense pact with nation states that would probably be within NATO. Whether or not that's a distinction without a difference, I don't really particularly see any other solution besides leaving it for chance that Russia will now take the much weaker, demilitarized state of Ukraine as a weak target that they could invade in 6 to 12 or however many months once the demilitarization process has completed and the Ukrainians have withdrawn from some of the most defensible positions in the country that the Russians are grinding themselves against. As for like what we should do to bring about an end at the peace table, at the negotiating table, this is what Trump should do. You know what Trump should do? Okay, Trump should go in there and he should say, fantastic, there'll be this business deal, there'll be that business deal. If you stop and you do the ceasefire and then you go into a peace deal, we can formalize the business deals, we can do this and we can do that. You are going to have to give up some of the territory you're occupying. I said publicly, I'm going to try to get some land back. I got to do it. I got to do it. And he goes in there and he says, that's the one option. The other option is that we do ramp up the sanctions. Not only do we ramp up the sanctions, but we also seize assets, the hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Russian assets in Europe. If you want to talk about cost, that's one way to deal with cost for at least a few years. The Russian economy is not in the best position it has been. Most Russian state media outlets, as well as Russian economists, are acknowledging that they are on a one-way path to recession, and it doesn't look good. And the only burgeoning part of the economic sector in Russia right now is the war sector, which is not an endless machine. You cannot just endlessly pump out tanks. Also, and I think Lactoid will probably agree with this, we should bomb Russia. I think that we should assist the Ukrainians in bombing the Russians, particularly in the targeting of production facilities for Shahed drones, ballistic missiles, and the things that have been terrorizing Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. This should be done. When you say assist, when I say assist, I mean give them the intelligence and give them the weapons to do it themselves.
Okay, I was just curious.
We have used this level of separation before, and we've been fine. The only people who have felt pain off of it have been the Russians, not us.
Do you agree with that, Lonerbox? I'm just really curious. Do you think that the Americans should be assisting in bombing Russian targets in that direct kind of manner?
Yeah, I think Europe obviously has to play a bigger role than they have in the last 10, 15, 20 years. But, like Biden said, there needs to be more of a moral center in Europe against these kinds of violations. But you can't do the opposite. Like, you're just rewarding aggression. I don't know why people have to still try to pretend that Russia has any kind of legitimate concern about NATO. I mean, you've had Tallinn, which is not that far from St. Petersburg and Moscow. Riga is not that far from St. Petersburg and Moscow. Both these countries have been in NATO for a very long time. Finland is now in NATO with an enormous fucking border with Russia. Russia doesn't really have that much of a right to think that, to treat NATO as a threat so large that they get to invade another country that they've recognized the territorial sovereignty of to avoid. You can't reward aggression, because the real reason Russia doesn't want strong security guarantees for Ukraine is so they can get more later. That's it.
There's a few more,
Okay.
just a few quick things. I'll try to make it quick. I did want to just add also, there should be a little, and this is rough, but if the Russians want to continue a war, I mean, it is war, you have to increase Russian casualties. You have to, they are doing mass infantry assaults across the line. And obviously, if you were giving infantry thermal blankets and telling them to shuffle through a forest, cluster munitions, artillery shells, mortar shells, RPG warheads attached to FPV drones, all of these things are tools that you could use to deal with that problem. And the more tools you put in your tool belt and the more you can grind it down and bring up the cost, honestly, the sooner I think the war will end. Or at least the sooner the war will end without a third or fourth chapter. And I say fourth chapter because I'm very pessimistic. As for like Zelensky and Putin not having to meet, this is one thing I just wanted to quickly address. I do think it would be good for the reason that Lactoid raised earlier. He talked about the need for Zelensky to have an election to raise legitimacy of the office, so it would hurt the Russians when trying to delegitimize them for a future invasion. Well, if Zelensky and Putin were able to meet and the United States government able to make Putin and Zelensky meet, then that would be a certain amount of legitimacy that is being garnered not only to Zelensky, but also the Ukrainian representatives as a whole, the Rada, the entity of Kiev, XYZ, like the idea of Ukraine. And until the Russians are willing to sit down with the Kiev authorities, whatever they may be, it seems to be like a continued commentary, at least by many people in Russia, of a delegitimization of the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian government. So until they meet, it is going to make it seem less likely to succeed, not only the peace deal, but just the recognition of their neighbors as their sovereign neighbor.
All right. I agree that Zelensky and Putin should meet. No disagreement there. I think that'd be fine. I don't think it's needed, but I think it's good when world leaders try to discuss an end to conflict. That's good. So I'm against bombing Russia. I'm against U.S. forces either directly bombing Russia. I think that would be bad. I don't think we ever even came close to that during the Cold War. Maybe someone can like educate me on a situation in which U.S. bombers flew over Soviet cities and bombed factories. That would be, I think, really bad. In the event that we're giving Ukraine all the tools to then go and bomb Russia, I'm obviously, I still think this is bad. I don't think it's as bad as if we did it directly for obvious reasons. I think if we did it directly, I mean, this is a nuclear armed country. I think that this might be one of the few scenarios in which that actually starts to go on the table, depending on what's hit, which is like
us giving the stuff
worst case scenario.
Us hitting them directly or both?
Us hitting them directly.
Okay.
I think that is kind of we're kind of there at that point. Us giving them the stuff, I think it gives the Russians room to expand even further, and because I mean, if you think of something comparable, right? Like if we, in our war with Iraq, in which we just kind of win there, and of course, we were rewarded for being kind of the invaders there. In our war in Iraq, when we invaded there, if the Russians started giving like the Iraqis like some long range Scuds or something along those lines that they were then using to like fire at Washington D.C., I think that would be really like the Americans, like we would not take it nearly as well as I think Russia is taking the fact that like their own cities are being bombed in what historically would have been some kind of like a proxy conflict, but now is a very direct conflict involving Russia directly. So I don't like the idea of bombing Russia. I think it's bad, but of course I'm against giving Ukraine more money, so that should probably be obvious. And the whole rewarding conflict thing, again, I mean, this could be applied really to any war when it comes to like the victor. We are rewarded when we win and we are punished when we lose. And it's just this fantasy land of like, well, Russia's not going to eventually get something out of this war. I mean, you're right that perhaps we could win if we did start bombing Russia directly and launching some kind of conventional invasion. But I'm against that for a whole host of other reasons.
Well, to be clear, I'm not proposing we landed Vladivostok and Alaska too.
I'll let you go in a second, but during the Cold War, Russians and American troops did kill each other on occasion. Like
we didn't bomb Soviet cities
and killing, but
yeah, I understand that, but we didn't bomb Soviet cities during the Cold War, did we?
I just wanted to just correct the record there, but go ahead.
You didn't correct anything. We didn't bomb. I specifically said bombing Soviet cities.
Oh, so if we had instead of bombing Soviet cities, we'd bombed Soviet military installations, that'd be okay?
If there were Soviet troops like embedded within like their proxy forces in different areas, and then they die, that is wholly different than bombing the cities of them. I would hope that'd be clear.
Go ahead, Dylan.
I do want to throw out there that, this did happen historically. Like the Soviets, for example, tested air defense systems in Vietnam against American Hueys. I've met some of the engineers who worked on those air defense systems. So there is historical precedent for the idea of not only direct military launches against American soldiers, but those were not even done by local Vietnamese forces. Those were done by Soviet forces testing the weapons on American soldiers. It did not lead to World War III. It did not lead to this gigantic, interstate conflict. When you add layers of separability between atomic hellfire and yourself as a leader, you tend to take that level of separation. A leader is very slow to use the nuke, and if they can see a better pathway, they tend to take it. This has been true for the Russians. This has been true for the Chinese. This has been true for the Indians. And so far, Biden's already tested the theory of giving the Ukrainians the missiles and then giving them the coordinates and then having them strike it and then having them disable the target. And it did not lead to this, it didn't lead to any escalation. In fact, not only did it not lead to a gigantic confrontation, if anything, the Russians started kind of downplaying the Kursk incursion, downplaying these things in some ways to try to do a little PR cover. But the point is, I don't think that it would be that big of a risk to us for us to target Russia's war-making capacity, not their civilian infrastructure, not like some water treatment plant, but specifically the factories that are making the drones that are being dropped on Ukrainian cities, that are flying towards Ukrainian cities every day. I did also want to just throw out there that polling about support for the war. That is true that there has been a drop in the amount of people who want to see the war continue by double digits. But also, when you add follow-up questions about things like, would you be willing to end the war on Russia's terms, and then they describe, broadly speaking, what the Russians are offering, and then you have something like 80% of Ukrainians that reject it. So yes, it is true that most Ukrainians, after 4 years of war in their backyard and cities being razed to the ground, they want to see the end of the war, but they don't want to sacrifice what the Russians are asking of them. So yes, they want to see the end of the war, but there's context.
So I'm going to clarify that. Can I clarify that context, because there's a little context that Dylan's also leaving out.
For Dylan after that.
Sure. So you're right. There are follow-up questions. However, when asked these follow-up questions of different plans that could be negotiated, because again, the question is, should we fight till victory or reach some kind of negotiated end to the war? Most Ukrainians are in favor of a negotiation that does result in some territory being transferred over to the Russians. You're right that they want to see some kind of negotiation that doesn't give the Russians everything that they're asking for. That's true. But I think that this is more of a proxy to me in terms of war enthusiasm. Where at the beginning of the war, everyone's like, we're going to fight until the end. We're going to win this war. But now they're like, shit, this sucks. We're going to fight. Please, let's negotiate some kind of end to this. And that's different, of course, compared to the Russian side that is, the war is primarily popular within Russia right now.
Sorry, continue.
At least based on the numbers. I mean, I'm sure you're going to say they're fake. I mean, you could find me something to the alternative, but based on what I've researched.
The numbers are, so I couldn't say if they were fake or not. But
sure.
I mean,
I'll send them to you after the debate.
The numbers that I have seen seem to suggest that the majority of Russians would like an immediate negotiated settlement to the war. That most of them are not maximalists who want to take Kiev or want to push on to these more extreme war demands. That most of them at this point kind of want to cut the losses and get it all over with.
But the current demands aren't marching all the way to Kiev, just to be clear about that. The other thing I wanted to say is... the majority of Russians don't seem that pressed to cross the river again. I want to make it very clear, because again, I made a point earlier that it just seems like you guys are maybe implicitly misrepresenting. My point is, I think that there could be a major escalation, potentially including tactical nuclear weapons or some kind of nuclear response, in the event that American bombers fly over Russian cities and bomb Russian cities. Very specifically, I understand this hasn't happened in the Vietnam context, and this hasn't happened when it came to us giving certain weapons to Ukraine. But I do think that both of those situations are bad for not only all the reasons I outlined earlier in this debate, but it's bad because of the potential for the Russians to take that as okay, we're going to go further and expand our war to potentially even including Kharkiv, which they occupy a part of.
If American bombs and American bombers were to strike at Russian forces within the borders of Ukraine, would you think it would lead to that same escalation, Lactoid?
Not the same level, probably not like nuclear retaliation, but it would lead to some kind of serious retaliation.
I was just curious. And to Dylan, during the summit tomorrow, do you think that it is something that Trump should do or will do, or maybe to discuss with Putin whether, I guess I'll ask this, how much do you think that Trump realistically can get Putin to kind of back off his demands that he's currently making, if at all, right? Do you think that there is any, like, even if it's just a token and Trump is like, well, if you just give up this portion of Kharkiv or something, or this, right?
I think the most I could imagine is Sumy and maybe Kharkiv. I keep saying Kharkiv, but it's, I don't even know about that, because the Russians would like to take Kupiansk. The Russians are pushing through Vovchansk right now, but the Russians are also getting their teeth kicked in the Sumy Oblast. So I don't know, but I think that's the furthest I could imagine, is them offering to give back the relatively small amount of territory that is occupied in the Sumy region that they're currently losing, and the Kharkiv region. I mean, that's honestly the most I would have expected them to offer, and the Ukrainians aren't going to go for it.
Maybe you know that.
I actually agree with that.
Yeah, maybe you know this, Lonerbox. There was talk, at least a few months ago, of Poland, at least certain groups in Poland, wanting to kind of enter the war on Ukraine's behalf. Do you think that that's still a thing that people are talking about? And do you think that there's any way that that can be done or allowed without involving NATO proper, right? Even though Poland is a part of NATO, do you think that we could maybe, like, I don't know, just kind of let them off the leash and promise not to invoke Article 5 if they get stomped or whatnot?
Well, last I checked was that Tusk was against that, but they've had an election since then, so I guess it depends on who won, right?
Yeah, well, that's why I'm asking you, because I'm not sure, right?
Novaki won. He's not seen as generally as supportive of Ukraine as Tusk, so I don't think he would do it.
Yeah, Novaki's okay. Yeah, he's less likely to do it than Tusk. Yeah, okay. That's just what you said, but yeah. We're going back to something that Lactoid said earlier about whether or not we reward aggression. There's a difference between rewarding aggression and rewarding the winner. The winner is someone that takes what they can, regardless of whether or not they earned it fairly, but they've just created a reality where there's not really any means to reverse it. And obviously, Russia does this. Like, that's their way. Like, whenever there is an inch, whenever there's an opening that they can take a hold of, they will use it. Like, that's why there are some rumblings in Transnistria. Well, Russia goes and sends troops in there. There's rumblings in Georgia. They go in there. That's what they do. They take advantage of where there are possibilities to expand territory, and that's when they did it in Ukraine as well. That's why it didn't happen to NATO countries. That's why people in Europe really want to join NATO. As far as it goes with Ukraine, Ukraine has managed to stave a lot of the Russian invasion, especially the early years, because they had support. I just don't know why, unless you support the aggression, you would ever want to live in a world where this aggression can yield like a reward that couldn't be staved. If you can like reduce the reward that people get to the point that Russia doesn't really claim a victory so much as salvage one compared to what they were initially expecting, then that's surely better than giving them whatever they're asking for now when they have an advantage.
Well, I think what they're
go ahead.
Well, I think what they're asking for now is, again, it's like not the maximal that they could be asking for. The fact that included in their proposal is that that Ukraine would join the European Union, I think is interesting. You wouldn't see a country that has like an actual goal of like fully incorporating a country into itself have that kind of stipulation. I would expect to see something along the lines of, Ukraine has to join the Eurasian Economic Union. You got to come join our customs union. I think then that might be more of a question of like, what's the kind of the future plans here? The fact that they are, presenting that as a sort of preliminary concession, I think is interesting. And then when it comes to, I think we're just going to like, we're going back and forth with examples. I don't know if we're going to be able to like fully agree on this. I don't think there's a substantive difference between how you're describing Russia being rewarded for aggression and really any other power being rewarded for aggression, right? So, when we talk about, you brought up Georgia. Well, I mean, we can also bring up the fact that the European Union investigated the Georgian conflict, and in 2008 had a report that the Georgians were responsible by shelling South Ossetia. And there was actually kind of an embarrassment in the EU because they wanted the report to say something else, but it didn't. And so, that just to specifically address that one example, when it comes to Transnistria, yeah, I know that there are, and there's some post-Soviet like frozen conflict zones, and there's peacekeeping Russians there. But I mean, so far, and even with the current peace deal, there doesn't seem to be any kind of realistic situation of Transnistria being annexed into Russia with all of Ukraine, or at least most of Ukraine in between. I guess it's theoretically possible. I don't know. I highly doubt it. And of course, I think it's discounting the fact that, the U.S. and NATO and really any other major power will take influence where it can, and it will be geopolitically rewarded for it, right? Syria, Libya, Iraq, we were invested in these areas because of their geopolitical importance. Let's not pretend that's not part of this. And so, yeah, we were rewarded for winning, and there really wasn't a punishment on us. And I think Russia's going to see the same. They are winning this war, and there's not going to be any kind of like serious like punishment on them. Yeah, they're probably not going to get everything that they want. I actually think that the most, like, I think the peace deal that's most likely, that's actually somewhat favorable to Ukraine to some respect, I think would be not only Ukraine joining the EU, but Russia saying they're not going to try to take the rest of Kherson and Zaporizhia, and they're going to give back the areas in Sumy and Kharkiv. I think that is potentially like the best kind of deal that I think Ukraine's going to be able to salvage from the situation. And, if Ukraine says no, we're going to keep fighting on, I don't see the situation getting better for them. And maybe we just disagree on that, right? But I remember we've been talking about this subject, maybe not with you, Lonerbox, but, with other people, and Dylan included, for a while now, for months now. And every single time I'm talking about it, I'm saying the Russians are gaining advantage. And then the next time we have the talk, they've gained some advantage. So I don't see it getting better. I mean, maybe things turn around. I can't guarantee that. The Russians are going to continue to win, but everything is pointing to that continuing happening.
Why do you think, when Russia says no, why do you think they are so opposed to any kind of security guarantee or multinational security guarantee for Ukraine at this moment in time?
It's going to be the same reason why the U.S. was opposed to Cuban missiles, or why we would prevent Canada from joining.
What do you? No, it's not. It's not about Cuba. It's not the same as Cuban missiles. Do you think Russia fears a NATO or even a non-NATO invasion or attack or a strike?
To some extent, yeah. I think Russia fears because, of course, NATO has acted offensively in the past for what it deems to be human rights violations, and at the same time,
right?
Well, I've got two people here who are saying we should bomb it. And so I don't know how hinged Russia believes a lot of Americans are. Maybe
I think they should help by supplying weapons to a country that they're invading. That's not the same as just like, do you think NATO, seriously, do you think there's no way you believe that NATO has any aspiration to capture parts of Russia or to invade parts of Russia? There's no way you believe that.
You are saying, it's incredible. In the same debate, you're openly saying, yes, bomb them. And then you're saying it is totally unbelievable that NATO could pose a direct threat to the Russian territory. Yeah, I don't know in what form it would come. I don't know if it would come in the form of, I doubt it would come in the form of some kind of territorial annexation. But here are situations that it could happen. It could happen in perhaps territorial annexation from what maybe Ukraine claims, when it comes to Crimea or any kind of territories that are ceded this time. It could come in the form of some kind of regime change concern, right? There's plenty of reasons. You can just say, well, Russia has no reason to fear anything. Why don't they just disband their military, right? They got nothing to fear when it comes to NATO. And I think this is just, again, it's myopic, and it's not factoring in what they're afraid of.
So asking a sovereign state to dismantle its own military is not the same as asking them to tolerate other countries that are not them joining defensive alliances. All the examples you gave there, by the way, was assuming that Russia might fear NATO coming to help Ukraine reclaim their territory. Even Crimea, that would be Ukraine reclaiming territory that Russia has officially recognized as Russian, as far as the Budapest Memorandum goes. So, and also majority voted to be in part of Ukraine for independence.
So is this not... So, okay, first of all, I don't think when you use the word reclaiming, I don't think that's relevant when we're talking about what the Russian motivation is when it comes to NATO. Russia probably does want to avoid a situation in which Ukraine in the future has some kind of reconquest ideas when it comes to Crimea. This is probably a major motivation when it comes to their concern about Ukraine being aligned with NATO and Western powers. Russia is also probably concerned about the potential of regime change. I'm sorry, we are not strangers to looking at a country and figuring out some way of removing the leader we don't like and putting somebody else
Libya. Is that you think Putin's worried that he's going to get fucking bayonet in the ass by what? I don't know that this is the most, it's just such an unbelievably vague, nebulous concern. When is it not just much more clear that Russia wants to capture more later?
Well, no. One last thing. I think it's like weird that you're acting so, again, incredulous. It seems to be your MO on this. When you earlier were advocating for bombing Russia, and just now you were
advocating for supplying Ukraine with the means to hit Russia. Yes.
Well, didn't Wick? Maybe I'm wrong. Didn't Wick you ask if like America bombing
Lonerbox? I think you're mixing up.
Maybe you don't support American.
I could have misheard it too.
Sure. Maybe you don't support American forces
I don't want to
bombing them.
Russia directly. I just, when he lands in Alaska, one clean shot, okay?
Okay. All right. Well, I mean, really, at the end of the day, yeah. So whether or not it's America bombing them directly, and maybe if you didn't say that or hint to that, I apologize, Lonerbox. But I think it doesn't necessarily change the kind of risk calculation if they're concerned about some other entity that is armed and supplied and trained by America firing missiles also into Russia. They have plenty of reason to want to avoid NATO weaponry in Ukraine. And you also sort of hinted like, oh, that would just be a reconquest if Ukraine came back and took back Crimea. That's something the Russians want to avoid. They don't want to have Crimea go back to Ukraine. So yes, of course they don't want to have them join NATO.
But do you think it's justified that they don't want Ukraine to be able to recapture territory that is legally theirs? That's what I'm asking you.
Well, no, there's two different questions now, because the first question is why would they want Ukraine to not be part of NATO? And that involves like geopolitical interests of not wanting Ukraine to pose a threat to Crimea again. But if we want to go back to justification, I mean, that goes back to the moral arguments that Wick dragged us away from. I think that the Crimea, of course, belongs to Russia based on the events in 2014 and the polling before and after.
Well, before the polling was mixed, but in any case, it's like...
No, it wasn't.
Yes, it was.
It was absolutely
Are you referring to the IRI? Yeah, okay.
No.
But he's a good streamer.
No. So my understanding is that my understanding is that there's been multiple polls on that. The UN launched a poll that found that most Crimeans would vote to leave Ukraine and join Russia. This was between I think 2011, and then
depends on which
there was a poll
in that UN poll you read.
No. I've seen you misrepresent this. Listen very closely to my words. You're referencing a different section of the poll, and that I can explain. But there is a different chart that you scroll down. Like when you're scrolling, you scroll over it every time when you're showing your audience, like Wikipedia. There is a different section of the. Yes, there is a different section that specifically asks if it came to a vote today, who would you vote? And there's only two options on this question.
Wikipedia what?
I'm saying when you bring up, because I've seen you do this sometimes. I've lurked on your stream once or twice, Dylan, maybe for like 10 minutes each. Okay, I've seen you do this.
Okay.
You specifically try to rebut me on this specific claim when it comes to the UN poll, and you'll bring up the Crimean autonomy referendum Wikipedia, and you'll scroll down. You scroll right past the results that I'm referring to, and scroll to a different table that is asking a different question. Okay. Mm-hmm. The very specific question that I'm saying, or the very specific thing I'm saying, is that when the UN polled the Crimeans, over 70% of them, according to the most recent one, and the UN said they would vote to leave Ukraine and join Russia. Only 14% said they would not vote. And then I think 30-something% were undecided. But
I think the UN reaffirmed Ukraine's territorial integrity. Why do you think they condemned the annexation?
So again, totally different line of thought. Right now I'm talking about the self-determination of the Crimean people. I'm talking about the fact that the people there wanted to vote to leave Ukraine and join Russia, and the fact that Pew Research did polls 2 months after this and found that the overwhelming majority of people pretty much agreed in line with the referendum. When you're talking about why does the UN currently deem it to be, what specific question you asked, Lonerbox?
The annexation to be illegitimate, and they reaffirm it to be part of Ukraine.
Yeah, they probably are appealing to like an idea of international law, national sovereignty, stuff like that. They're not going to challenge. They're not going to. I mean, I disagree with it on sometimes. I disagree with it, for example, if the government's like doing a bunch of bad shit. Sometimes you get to violate their sovereignty and go in and stop them. I also disagree with
how a majority of people in Scotland voted to stay in the EU, and then obviously the English vote took us out of the EU. Does that mean the EU should come in like fucking roll troops in to take us back?
Those Scottish people voted in that election too.
Yeah. Just a housekeeping thing. If anyone wants to send me the poll, right?
Yeah, but we voted to stay in the EU. Right?
We can look at it.
Which poll? Because there's multiple polls. I think he's talking about a Wikipedia article.
I'm not talking about. I tagged you on Twitter on this, and you didn't respond. I literally tagged you the exact chart. Yes, I did. I tagged you the exact fucking screenshot. Well, I'm sure. I tagged you the exact fucking screenshot with a link to the UN study. It has the table that you're referring to, which we can talk about, and there's a complex explanation for that, but it's not the question that I'm referring to. The question I'm referring to is, if you voted, how would you vote? Would you vote to leave or would you vote to stay? The vast majority of Crimeans would vote to leave. This is important, okay, because it shows what the actual preferences of Crimeans one way or the other.
Just two
why do you want to go past the polling from the Razumkov Center or even by Gallup? I guess you'd say that was USAID, but it was Gallup the poll.
No, it wasn't. It was the Baltic Surveys Limited, which claims to be an affiliate of the Gallup organization, and they got the data from a. They didn't even go in and get the data. So, and by the way, I tried to find data or find information on that specific poll, and it's not clear if Gallup was ever involved at all. What it appears to be is that Baltic Surveys Limited claims, and Gallup doesn't even acknowledge them on its own website, but it seems like Baltic Surveys Limited claims to be a Gallup affiliate. Maybe they are, all right? But Baltic Surveys Limited commissioned a poll, which then that poll came from a different organization that was on the ground in Ukraine. And then they got that information from that. And then it was funded by the IRI, which is a Republican think tank, and USAID. That's a lot of concern, especially when this poll goes against the UN. It goes against the findings. It goes against the findings of the UN. It goes against the findings of Pew Research, and it goes against what the results are in the referendum. Now, you can say the referendum's bullshit, despite the fact that it agrees with most credible sources, as opposed to
it does. The 95% result of the referendum that agrees with polls.
It agrees. No, it's 95%, or I think it's 93% of the people who voted, and 20% of the population boycotted the election. And so, when you look at it that way, actually. It's roughly in line with the Pew Research poll that came immediately afterwards, which found that only 4% said that the Ukraine should not recognize the results of the referendum, and 88% said yes. You have to factor in the people who also don't vote.
The people who voted, the parliament wasn't locked in by Russian troops that went in there?
Yes, this was after there were troops on the ground.
That's that's testimony by Igor Girkin, who said when they took over the Crimean parliament, they held the politicians at gunpoint and made them dissolve it.
Irrelevant to the actual will of the people in Crimea.
It's a separate thing. I mean, it's wrong, obviously, but it's separate from the polling of the public. If somebody could get me the Wikipedia article, I can't find the Wikipedia. I looked up Wiki Crimea polling to see if I could find this Wikipedia. I can't find it. If someone can send it to me,
I will post it in the group chat.
Okay, thank you.
It's just that there are different poll results, because you had the Razumkov Center that said 60% of them would want to join.
Well, I'm pretty sure that said 63%, which is still pretty close to this. Yes, but that was I think earlier.
And then a similar number, 53.8, saying that they would also want autonomy within Ukraine. This is not a basis for a military to come into the country.
Let me explain. The poll you're referring to right there, I'm pretty sure, if I'm not mistaken, that was from 2008, which is before the UN poll that has the latest results in 2011. The UN poll from 2011 has over 70% of Crimeans saying they would vote to leave to join Russia. If you're, I will.
Yeah.
I'm responding to Lonerbox right now. Give me 1 second.
Can you show it on screen, by the way?
I can't. I cannot do three things at the same time. I'm sorry. I'm responding, and then I will post the results, because I have it all. Okay, I can find it for you.
I actually have it. Somebody sent it to me.
Great. So when you're saying that 60, what would you say, 63% from the Razumkov Center? If you're saying that 63% are saying yes, we would vote to leave Ukraine and join Russia, but in the event they don't let us do that, we still want to have greater autonomy.
They didn't say in the event they don't let us do that. They just said it was another option.
Okay, but a higher percentage would just prefer straight out, let's just leave and join Russia.
Yeah, and numbers like this are not a basis ever for a military to come in and hold a referendum at gunpoint. This is just not what you do.
No, so it can be if the people there have their democratic will violated by an unconstitutional coup, like how the U.S. left the UK, which we 100% had a right to do.
Okay, this is what you're talking about?
Unless you want to deny our revolution.
Lactoid, is this what you're looking at right here?
Yeah.
Okay, so in 2011...
65%, my bad, 65%. I overstated it.
Yeah, 65% And to be clear, it was 70% in 2009, and it's reduced to 65% 2011 Q4. Is 2011 the most recent one?
2011 was when this study ended. Look at the no vote. It's 14.2%.
Sure.
So 14.2% would vote no in terms of staying with Ukraine. Or, sorry, to stay with Ukraine.
Out of interest, when you keep saying they have their sovereignty violated, and you compare that to America, where's the
just the tiniest favor?
Matt, you want to scroll down and talk about the table below?
If you want to right now, I was going to talk about something else, but sure, we can do that now.
Sure, yeah, we can talk about this, and we can read the question and realize it's a totally different question, and then talk about what it means.
My point when I'm remembering, this is all coming back to, you've thought about this a lot more than obviously I have. I remember thinking.
Okay, that was a subtle diss.
Well, if it came off that way, I didn't mean to. I was just being honest. I didn't know you tweeted at me. But this right here is the UN asking two separate questions, right? They asked one question,
Correct.
then asked a separate question. And my problem with you, Lactoid, was you just citing because there's one poll here that says, if you just ask people straight up, do you want to be part of Russia? You want to be independent? The UN comes out with the data that says, hey, the majority of them want to be part of Russia. Other polls disagree, but obviously the UN is more credible than a lot of other pollsters, and so it has a lot of weight. Then they ask a separate question, and they ask people, what is the optimal model for you in Crimea? And when you combine the different data points here, become part of the Russian Federation, become an independent state, stay in Ukraine with greater autonomy, stay in Ukraine with the same level of autonomy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you find out that majority of Ukrainians either want to stay in Ukraine with some level of different autonomy, normal region of Ukraine, XYZ, with a small in-between amount being for an independent state.
So I'm going to explain why this is a different question and why we have to, why this question is not incompatible with the prior question. Because remember, these two questions were from the same survey. The same people who answered this table also answered the prior table. They also answered the prior question, in which 65% of them said they would vote to leave and join Russia, and only 14% would not vote to join and leave Russia.
But then with
the reason why,
nuance,
well, hold on. Yes, but this nuance is irrelevant when it comes to the Crimean referendum, because when you look at it, okay, so the optimal solution, what this question means is, fellow Crimean, if you could have the world, if you could have any potential political situation going forward, even like reasonable or unreasonable, if you could just have one, which one would it be? And yes, in this, 41% said the most optimal solution ever is joining Russia. 11% said, oh, we would want to become independent, but if we can't do that, I guess then we'll join Russia, according to the poll above. A next line here says, stay in Ukraine with greater autonomy, but if we can't do that, I guess join Russia, because of the prior question, right? And then obviously I would agree that and really the votes, the percentages after this
you're assuming
would be, well, it is a valid assumption, because the same people who answered this way also answered that 65% of them would vote to leave Ukraine and join Russia. And so if the same people are saying that, and then when they're asked a follow-up question of, okay, and then now that we know which way you would vote, what's the most optimal thing you would choose? What this shows is that Crimeans, 41% said 100% yes, Russia, 11% are saying independent, but there must be, for these people, because remember, these people voted, they said they would vote to yes to join Russia. These people are obviously saying the next best alternative is joining Russia. Same thing with stay in Ukraine with greater autonomy, because clearly, perhaps they don't think that Ukraine's going to give them autonomy based on actions in Euromaidan. Clearly, they would prefer to join Russia in the event that they can't get the optimal scenario.
Was the Euromaidan in 2011? I forget my time.
Euromaidan was in 2014, early 2014.
It was after the Maidan, when the Rada was still
and late 2013.
When Yanukovych was gone. When Yanukovych was gone, was there any effort from the Crimean, either their equivalent of the parliament or any of their institutions, to actually try and push for any kind of autonomy or independence?
It was the Russians went in very quick, and there was a lot of
interesting.
There was a lot of Crimean self-defense forces that joined up with the Russians and helped them. In fact, a lot of the violence was not actually associated with the Russian military, but with these kind of like Crimean self-defense forces.
Yeah, there were also a lot of indigenous people who fled because they needed to be fucked. I'm just wondering if you read every action by Russia in this kind of level of very of charitability, because even I looked up what you said about Georgia and that EU report. Now I haven't read the 700 pages, but it's just interesting that you left out the fact that not besides them saying that Russia's initial counterstrike was legal, then they also said that the military response afterwards was against international law and it was an overreaction because they pushed into Georgia proper. Now, why would they push into further than wherever the issue is, if they weren't also just trying to use the opportunity, like I said, using opportunities to reclaim control over former Soviet territory? That's also why did they lie that Georgia was carrying out fucking genocide against people in South Ossetia?
So your point doesn't make sense because it's like directly contradictory to like what you think the general like conclusion is. Because remember, so the EU report blames Georgia for starting it. They do blame both parties for how they conducted the war. They do put blame on Russia for some of the weapons that I think they were using, cluster weapons, which is horrible. And there was blame put on Russia for how they were conducting the war. And there was also blame on Georgia for how they were conducting the war. But then the Russian forces that were in Georgia pulled out and went back to South Ossetia. So if your argument is, well, sometimes the Russians, like other people start conflicts against the Russians, and then they invade, and then they leave, and then they pull back, and they pull their troops out. Is that your point?
Are we done with this poll, by the way? Can I close it down?
Yeah.
The only thing I wanted to say about this poll is that if you look throughout this data, what you'd have to accept, number one, we're basing a lot off of one poll. We're basing a lot of the fate off of a people off of a poll that was 3 years old. And as you could see through time, it was descending in the other direction when it comes to the Russians. But if you look at, you have to assume that to stay in Ukraine with autonomy, become a normal region of Ukraine, that all of these decreased and they all went to be part of Russia. You have to assume that even when you talk about become part of a direct control by the president office of Ukraine, you have to assume that a certain amount of people who had wanted the president of Ukraine to directly control Crimea went around and said, actually, I want to be part of Russia. Now, I'm not saying that, we could just disregard this poll. What I am saying is that starting an invasion of a foreign country, capturing that, and then not giving them the options that they wanted is not justified, especially since it's illegal under international law and the Russians agreed that they wouldn't do it.
Okay, a couple things. First of all, I appeals to law right on the backs of a illegal coup. I'm not. Bring it back up again. I want to respond to something he said.
People have seen the number. Can we just get like a JPEG and put it up?
Well, just so for the stay in Ukraine with reduced autonomy. I mean, it's in terms of like presidential control or whatever. We're talking 0%, 0%, 0%, and yes, in 2011, 0.1% did want this. The only like two here that like really wanted to keep it kind of status quo on the Ukraine side was the 12.4% that wanted to stay in Ukraine with the same level of autonomy, and the 6.1% that wanted to become a normal region of Ukraine.
You know what I think when I see data like this, Lactoid, though?
Can I? Well, real quick. So this is not also just one poll. This is a poll from 2011, 2010, 2010, 2010, 2010, 2009, and 2009. This is multiple polls done by the United Nations over the course of multiple years. If you had this kind of data, you would be hammering the fuck out of me with it. You would be saying, look, this is what the UN says. When you would look at this data, it's very clear what this means, especially given that the prior question was asked by the UN, which was if you had to vote today, how would you vote? That is a different question than what is the most optimal scenario. And it's more reflective of what the will is of the people on the ground. And then when the prior point that I think it was Lonerbox made this, maybe I'm wrong, that was, well, all of a sudden it went to like everybody wanting to join Russia. First of all, that's not necessarily true because once again, you could have people who their optimal scenario is being an independent state or having greater autonomy, like come to the vote saying like, well, I prefer Russia to Ukraine as the, alternative and still vote that way. But you're also discounting the fact that Crimea in 2010 voted for Yanukovych. And in 2014, who was removed unconstitutionally. Do you think that might piss off some people and maybe make them have a little bit more affinity towards Russia and a little bit less affinity towards Ukraine? I think it's a reasonable assumption. I don't have all data that necessarily proves that, other than, of course, the referendum results and the Pew data that came 2 months after.
When you point towards the Crimean occupation that followed, even if I was to say that, because you look at the polling, it's mixed. The UN data, not as mixed. When it comes to one poll with the other poll, it says if they were given more options, they wouldn't want to be part of the Russian Federation. But if given one or the other, the UN poll says that from 2009 to 2011 that they did 3 years before the invasion. Now, now let's say that even if you wanted to be part of the Russian Federation, or let's say you wanted some dual citizenship program, there's probably a bunch of inroads where somebody would have accepted that, right? What the Russians instead chose is to take it upon themselves to invade Ukraine and make it so some in-between settlement was taken off the table. And it's not like the Russians didn't have the leverage in 2014 to try to assert themselves for either language protections or other things in Crimea. It's not like the Russians weren't involved in cultural programs in Crimea before. It's not like the Russians haven't spent tens of millions of dollars to promote Russian culture in Crimea back from Soviet times to today. So them invading and taking over in the manner they did, even if you wanted to be part of Russia, I could see somebody saying, yeah, I'd like to be part of Russia. No, I don't like them invading. I don't want a brother war. No, I don't like what happened to my Tatar neighbors that got taken out back, shot, and dumped in a river. I don't like that happened to that activist. No, I don't like how you can't play Ukrainian music anymore without being arrested. No, I don't like X, Y, and Z. This is why it shouldn't be. I don't know why you laughed at the idea of people in Crimea playing Ukrainian music getting arrested. I don't know.
Because you're doing the same thing again that I criticized before.
I mean, I asked you for examples of arrests for the Russian of people in.
I know. Super convenient. Super convenient that they pass a law banning it, and then they pass another law saying that media organizations have to be subservient to the state, and then we're like surprised that there's not a bunch of stories out of Ukraine about this. Wow, incredible.
Tavarish, I'm just saying that Russian occupation, the image of it in 2011 and in 2025 is very different, and we can look in retrospect. Somebody who wanted to be part of the DPR, who now has to throw a bag of feces out of their window, might have a different perspective.
The problem with that, though, is that as the conflict was going on, you actually saw support, because Zois Berlin did 2 different surveys on the DPR that I have, and support for the DPR actually went up over time. I think it was either 2015 to 2016 or 2014 to 2016.
Where was the polling?
But regardless, done? It was done in the It was done both in the there was polling in the Donbass, in the Ukrainian-controlled elements of the Donbass, and the DPR and LPR controlled areas.
And
of the
they're
Donbass.
saying that both the LPR areas and the non-LPR areas, that support for them increased between 2014 and 2022.
The DPR and LPR areas support for themselves, support for autonomy and not going back
what
to Ukraine.
What do you mean support for themselves?
Increased.
I'm talking about the region, not the LPR, DPR governments. I'm talking about the people in the region.
Well, because the results are different, right? So if you look at the results for the Ukrainian-controlled section, it's different than if you look at results from the people like in the DPR and the LPR, because obviously in those areas you have like more extreme. Yes. So in the DPR and LPR controlled areas, because it's a different data set, right? I'm referring to a different data set. That area had increased support for separation from Kiev over time. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And what happened to the demographics of the DPR and LPR over time?
Between this time, if you're going to say that like the Russians had some kind of like colonial project that I've heard, you're not going to be able to provide me any evidence that's sufficient to demonstrate this.
That's not what I was going to talk about. Well, there is a colonial project in other cities like Mariupol, but Donetsk specifically, the people left. Like Pete, there wasn't a lot of jobs. There wasn't a lot of opportunity. Obviously, being a frozen conflict right on your doorstep probably didn't help either. And a bunch of factors came in so that most of the young people left, and most of the people who stayed in the DPR, to be quite frank, are elderly or people who would have maybe had more sympathies in some ways towards the Russians. But that also shows that over time, many of the people decided to leave. So yes, if the people who thought it was shit leave, then the support for the occupation is going to go up. But the quality of life in occupied Donetsk has continuously degraded since 2014. I still get fairy tale stories from people from Donetsk about the football games, the Donetsk stadium that just, obviously don't happen anymore.
Look, that could happen. Can I say one thing? That could happen, but like I'm a little bit like miffed, or I guess not really super. I don't take it super well when there's all this concern now for the people living in the DPR. When the Ukrainian government was launching, according to Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, was torturing them, firing cluster missiles into civilian areas, and how most of the civilian deaths that occurred during the war between 2014 and 2022, most of the civilian deaths were in the DPR and the LPR. Why? Because of Ukrainian military action. So
the bombing, there was the Ukrainian and Russian armies. This is just sad. The Ukrainian Russian armies come from a Soviet doctrine and a type of, let's just say, leadership morality lack definitely back in 2014 that led to commanders on both sides being very loose when it came to the types of bombing that they engaged with and the fact that they wanted to preserve their personnel. I don't particularly think that the Ukrainians were bombing them in such a way that justified the Russians coming in and either doing the exact same thing. I mean, like, for example, when the Russians invaded in 2022, their big claim was there's some sort of genocide going on to the Donbass. They use the word genocide because it's basically saying, like, you're in the Super Bowl of crimes, you know? It's essentially trying to get attention from this type of bombing. And the bombing, you know, it was bad, but it was sporadic. It was on both sides, and
I wouldn't call it a genocide. I think it was war crimes, but I don't think it was a genocide. I agree.
Okay, I do need to make a little money, so I'm going to read my super chats now. Okay.
Also, before you do that, Wick, just to come back to Georgia again.
Yeah.
There were like tens of thousands of people, ethnic Georgians, who fled South Ossetia in 2008.
And Abkhazia. And
Abkhazia as well, yeah, and that they couldn't go back. Again, this is like still, and not even to mention that these are two.
That wasn't enforced by the Russia.
Russia doesn't have a right to either of these territories anyway. They don't even. Why are they there at all? It's not like It's not like South Ossetia has got like a massive Russian population.
So the expulsion did happen, and especially in Abkhazia, it happened. That is undoubtedly true. But the Russians didn't do that. That was the local authorities in Abkhazia and South Ossetia that did that. They did push a lot of people out, Georgians out, and I mean that should be condemned. I agree. But in terms of
this is contradictory to your report, which also blamed Russian forces for not being able to stop any atrocities by their forces. So
I know this is not contradictory to probably for I think the third time I'm going to say this. The report is critical of Russian actions during the war. It's also critical of Georgian actions during the war. The only reason I brought this up is because the most critical finding is that Georgia started it. The report found that Georgia was the one that started it. They started that conflict. The report puts squarely the blame on Georgia for that. And that was a report commissioned by the EU. We're not even talking about the UN. Now we're talking about an openly hostile party. Commissioned a report that found that Georgia was responsible. And then you're saying, like, well, why are the Russians even there? I mean,
wait, can I
those were autonomous areas that allowed the Russians there? I don't know.
I got to ask because I haven't read
Wait, say that again. What did you just say?
Those were autonomous areas that wanted the Russians there to protect them, probably because the Georgians had demonstrated in that war that they would attack without justification, according to the EU report.
In 1993, this is why Russia is in those two places at all.
Do you think
Georgia Civil War?
Do you think it's fair if you're an autonomous region and you're worried about this other party violating the ceasefire agreement and attacking you, that it's like reasonable for you to invite like a kind of stronger party to come protect you? I mean, this is literally the argument that you guys make for Ukraine.
What proportion of people in South Ossetia are like ethnic Russians?
I don't see how that's relevant to the point I just made.
Do you think there's like a majority? Like, do you think there's like in 1991, 92, 93, it was like an invitation for Russia to be there? That's why they're there? Like, there was like popular will?
Yes, I think the Russian forces that went into South Ossetia and were stationed in South Ossetia did so at the behest of the South Ossetians and the Abkhazians, because those were the autonomous regions that the EU found were attacked by Georgia unjustifiedly.
You're mixing up two conflicts. I'm talking about the Georgian Civil War in 93 as to why Russia's there at all. They're in a part of you realize that they're in a part of the world that's not the Russian Federation, right? Their military is in an area, dominating an area that is not theirs.
Hold on, let's read back. Just seriously, think about this. I'm going to repeat back to what you just said. A country has a military in another country that's not its own country.
More than that. We're not talking about American bases in a democracy or a state that lets them in.
Oh, no, we're talking about autonomous regions that were autonomous prior to the breakup of the Soviet Union that wanted Russian forces there.
Autonomous in this,
as opposed to us?
A region having autonomous means that they can invite a foreign military in there? Since when?
Potentially, like if we want to talk by terms of international law, I don't exactly know. But if we're talking about it's incredible that you think this is a gotcha. It's crazy.
I can see why you don't like comparing this to other conflicts, because there's just no other comparison that like NATO or any Western countries do that is comparable to this. That's why you don't like making those comparisons. That's why you shifted away from the idea that Putin has a legitimate threat of regime change from NATO. What? Because they did it in Libya, a guy that was basically like despised by his entire population anyway. I don't know why. Like,
It wasn't the only example I brought up, and that wasn't the only motivation that could happen.
Yeah, I know, but it's not. It's a completely invalid one. That's the point. It's just like ridiculous that you brought it up in the first place.
Yeah, I think that you thinking that the Russians don't have some anxiety about like a long-term regime change project from NATO, I think that's just.
How would that go? Yeah, okay, yeah. How would that go? How would NATO do a long-term regime change project?
I can like speculate as to potential ways. One of the ways perhaps could be like some kind of like cross-border like antagonism, kind of like how we saw like between like when Japan launched their war, right? Like the Marco Polo Bridge incident, where they sort of manufacture crises. It could be that Russia actually like does see itself in the future committing things that the West would call, and even me would call like human rights abuses or some other issue, and this could lead to NATO like having sufficient military threats on the border. This could also be NATO putting a whole bunch of extra shit on the border, causing the Russians to have to like politically respond by putting their own forces on the border. And perhaps Russia might not be in as financially like sound of a position to even do that. And this could lead to destabilization of like a regime in Russia. There's all sorts of ways that NATO could potentially do this in the future. What I'm saying is that for you to say that Russia has no concern or no kind of anxiety about this potentially happening in the future.
Oh, no, you can have an anxiety. You just don't have there's a legitimate fear of NATO using their power to force regime change in Russia. Like that's just, it's at least, not least of all, to the level that they actually have to put their military into other countries to avoid them joining NATO. That is not a legitimate security interest.
Yeah, I disagree. And my citation for this is going to be, we were very concerned about missiles going to Cuba, despite the fact that we, the year prior, launched the Bay of Pigs. And also, and this is speculative, but I would, bet my left nut on this. If Canada had a coup and then started to like put Russian missiles on the border, or like made an agreement to put Russian missiles on the border, or even like hinted that they might do this, we're rolling in tanks. There's just no way we would accept that as America. There's just no way.
Do you think we would have done the Bay of Pigs if Cuba already had the nukes?
I think that potentially, because the Bay of Pigs invasion was primarily done by CIA trained like militants that weren't actually affiliated with the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
and so like it was kind of like proxy.
There's a layer of separation, but you acknowledge the difference that Russia having these types of weapons like enters into the scenario that by you, like for example, Israel faces threats in the region. I do not believe that they're anywhere close to being pushed into the sea, in large part due to the fact that they have an atomic arsenal. Kim Jong-un has a lot of threats to his regime. I don't believe that there is any immediate circumstance which he will be invaded due to the possession of these atomic weapons. Russia has the largest atomic arsenal on the planet. There is something that they have that is special due to having that gives them a certain amount of, defensive flexibility.
A certain amount, yeah.
So I do think
I agree with that. A certain amount, yeah.
That this makes it more condemnable for them to engage in this invasion based on the idea of they're going to be put under regime change or invaded, especially when, let's be frank, the European armies were not in the state to be doing any invading of the Russian Federation.
Well, you say that, but like I always get like contradictory sort of like, well, the European military is like significantly larger, more well-funded, more well-armed, and backed by stronger economies than Ukraine. And yet everybody says like, well, look how pathetic Russia is in Ukraine. Like it's supposed to be a 3-day invasion, and here we are 3 years later. Like if that's when you compare the two,
to be clear, the
and you see Ukraine
is purchasing power and the way they have their defense industries matched up.
Yeah, and Europe has more.
When you have the Swiss and you have the German and you have the French industries not working at economies of scale, but are working on a local level, they can't produce the same capacity or at the same scale that Russia can when they produce across the entirety of the Russian Federation. They centralize their command, they centralize their production, and to be quite frank, their purchasing power goes a lot further when it comes to their production in comparison to Germany. And they have lower regulations, and they can run their factories 24/7, 7 days a week if they so choose, which is not the case in many of these countries with labor standards. And so that's why the Russians can produce more artillery than Europe.
Yeah, I think a lot of those countries would probably drop those requirements in the event of war. But
I do want to read some of my super chats. Make a
But
little
it would
money
take
today.
time for them to get that artillery produced, right? Like these factories
Yeah.
are taking time.
I don't think any kind of sufficient time though compared to Ukraine.
There would be.
I also just want to reiterate,
years.
like just for the last time, that like in 1991 to 93, the majority of locals in South Ossetia and Abkhazia fought on the side of the Georgian government. Russia used the fact, they abused the fact that they had a presence there. They abused the fact that there were some human rights violations happening, no doubt, and then exaggerated them, and then said, do you think Russia, you agree with that? You think that Russia is wrong when they accuse these countries of committing genocide against their own peoples? I don't know why the fuck you're laughing at that.
Well, I'm laughing because you just said, yes, there was like a bunch of human rights things that are a problem. And I'm like, what?
Oh, yeah, there's
like, here's what's happening. Hold on. Here's what's happening, right? You are focusing now. There's the 2008 war that I was focusing on, that Georgia was alleged to have started, and then the Russians came in and then moved back. I mean, this is the more recent conflict that I think is a better proxy for Russia's behavior, right? Going in, stopping the at-fault party, and then leaving. But you're now referencing back just following the fall of the Soviet Union, and then you're referencing a bunch of bad shit apparently that was happening to the Abkhazians and the South Ossetians. I haven't looked in as much depth on the 1993 conflict to come to like a significant enough conclusion or like a informed enough conclusion to say that the human rights abuses like justified Russian involvement. But this is irrelevant to the conflict I was referring to, which is the 2008 conflict in which Georgia found, or the EU found Georgia to be responsible. Don't you agree that 2008 is probably a better proxy for how Russia operates on the world stage than 1993?
Well, not entirely, because it's still Russia holding on to a territory that they had no place being in the first place.
It was autonomous before the Soviet Union collapsed. It was
autonomous doesn't mean that a foreign military can come in by force against the majority will of the people living there. That's what autonomous means.
You're emulating him so hard. No, it absolutely can, depending on like how they're treated. I already agree that a sufficient level of human rights violations could precipitate some kind of involvement from foreign party. This is
you also agree that Russia exaggerates these violations like quite frequently. So I'm just wondering why you think they do that, if not for just trying to reclaim territory that they used to have under their thumb before.
Sometimes,
that's a simple explanation.
Am I wrong about the Georgian report? Just real quick. Am I wrong about the Georgian report? The Georgian report didn't find, the EU report on Georgia didn't find Georgia responsible. It found that Georgia did preemptively started as Russia was building up on its borders.
It found them responsible. It found that they started the conflict. It held them responsible for starting the conflict. Yes. Firstly. Secondly, just because you can point to a conflict in which, like Russia says there's a genocide, and then I look into the details, and yes, there's a bunch of bad shit happening. It wouldn't rise to my definition of genocide. I mean, people, sides, like I agree actually with something that Dylan said before, which is that sides really like to claim genocide in order to kind of galvanize their position, right? The Ukrainians are, claiming genocide. The Palestinians are claiming genocide. Although, I don't know, every part, there's a lot of arguments as to the justification for each individual party claiming genocide or war crimes or all these things. But it absolutely could be the case that the war crimes that you sort of like brushed over in Georgia in 1993, or the human rights violations that you brushed over, could be sufficient for the Russian military to move in. That I don't know. I haven't done enough research into that specific conflict. I'm talking about the more recent conflict, the one that's a better proxy for Russia's behavior.
The reason you think I brushed over them is because I mentioned that they were happening and that Russia exaggerated it, because that is the common trend. That is what they always do. They always exaggerate violations as an excuse to go in to territory that they just so happen to have recently lost after the fall of the Soviet Union. That's just like the most basic explanation. It's like one of the most fundamental, like normal ways for countries to engage in territorial conquest. It's what the Nazis did when they went into Poland. It's what Russia did when they went into Georgia. It's what they did when they went into Donbass. They claimed genocide, and that was that's what they do.
If I come into your
a very
Lactoid,
obvious trend.
Lactoid, if I come,
are you going to do the immigration house comparison?
Just real quick, Lactoid, answer my question, please. If I come into your house and I bring all my friends, you didn't invite me, you didn't ask me to come, and I just start coming into your house, bringing all my buddies in, we start setting up shop, we start moving your furniture around, and you say, hey, get out. We're like, we ignore you basically. And then after a certain point, you get a gun and you shoot at us because we've invaded your territory. Who started that conflict?
All right, moderator, I'm glad you're getting involved in the discussion. I don't think you can compare. I don't think you compare.
Notice how
I'm answering. I'm answering. I literally went on to answer the question.
Complained about the moderator entering the conversation.
I literally
he understands.
I'm trying to answer. You're talking over me. I'm trying to answer. You're talking over me. You're literally. I went on. It was one quip.
I'm just explaining
it's one. Go ahead. One quip. It's one quip because it's a 3-on-1, and you have been like taking sides this whole time. You did the last debate too. That's whatever. It's how you run things. But I was one quip, and then I was going to go on to answer the question, which is I don't think, just like with immigration, when conservatives say, "Oh, so that you wouldn't let an illegal into your house," which this is a dumb point. You can't compare communities and cultures and countries to somebody's.
So no argument, just dumb point. Got it.
I'm presenting the argument. When you have a community. When you have a community, I believe in a certain level of self-determination for that community. This would be like me saying, "Oh, you think the U.S. should be independent? So I can just go in your house, go into a room, and then say it's mine because you think
was the UK into Georgia and shot at them."
Yeah, and the Spanish and the French sent troops to the continental U.S. and we armed ourselves and we fought the British. Would you, if it was a house and somebody came in and did that, would that be acceptable? If you want to boil it down to
the difference is that we're comparing it to countries that have broken away from the rule of another empire. Like that's the reason that Russia has these interests in all these countries is because they were what?
Since we care so much about sovereignty and like international law, and you can just keep referencing like the illegal Crimean referendum.
I still have an answer to my question, just to be clear. But
we're going to refer to law, the British Empire's law in 1776. So that's comparable to the norms of today.
You're right. I personally think that the self-determination of peoples is really what's important. Now, obviously, I'm also value a certain level.
In Abkhazia and South Ossetia.
I also value a certain level of consistency amongst international dealings, and so I think it's important to have some kind of undemocratic pre-event in order to justify separatism, for example. But when we're talking about the breakup of the Soviet Union, I think this was a sufficient event. I have been critical of Russia's activities in Chechnya following the breakup of the Soviet Union. I think they were wrong for that. I think the Chechens probably should have been granted independence. They probably should have been granted self-determination, just like the people in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. They wanted Russians to be there to defend them. In 2008, they should have let that happen. I think that's perfectly fine.
Just to be clear, if you could find any evidence that a majority of people in Abkhazia and South Ossetia initially wanted Russia to intervene and take that place over in the 90s, that would be very interesting.
I'm going to repeat it for the fourth time. I haven't done the sufficient research into 1993 conflict to know the specifics as to who's the good guy and the bad guy. In 2008, the bad guy was Georgia, according to the EU. Okay, and that was it. And I think you can disagree. You can disagree, but I think that is a better proxy, 2008, because it's much more recent and involves the current president of Russia, right, or the current power structure of Russia. That is a much better proxy for Russia's actions going forward than 1993, immediately following the collapse of the Soviet Union, in which a bunch of republics were declaring independence from this previous super country that was, and all these different areas leaving. Oftentimes illegally, but of course, I also agree that that's not necessarily super important, but it does give rise to justification within that certain time frame for certain actions.
So I found interest.
Do you think it's irrelevant information that Russia's initial presence in Abkhazia and South Ossetia with their military was, despite the fact that most people there fought alongside of the Georgian government? Do you think that's an irrelevant piece of information to 2008?
I think it's irrelevant when we're looking at how Russia operates, because the argument is, this is Russia's history. This is what Russia does. Whenever they get an excuse to do something, they'll move in and take as much as possible. 2008, they didn't do that. They didn't start it. Somebody else started it, and then when their troops completed the mission,
they didn't fire the first shot.
And here you're back. Here you're back. When the troops were done with their mission,
you're just lying about what happened.
I'm not lying.
You are lying about what happened.
Did the troops leave Georgia proper and go back to South Ossetia?
That's not what I'm saying you're lying about. I'm saying the start of the war, the Russians were the ones who sent in their troops first. And yes, the Georgians shot first.
That was allowed by the ceasefire agreement.
Putting their troops there.
Yeah, that was allowed.
Right?
That was allowed by the ceasefire.
They were not supposed to be.
That was allowed by the ceasefire agreement.
They shot against the backdrop of Russia being
that was allowed.
Especially in Abkhazia since the 90s.
That was allowed by the ceasefire agreement that Georgia signed. They were allowed there. So that was the ceasefire agreement. They were allowed to be there. And then in 2008, Georgia broke it, according to the EU. And this was the same Russian.
According to the EU, Russia is currently unjustifiably invading Ukraine right now. Do you think, will you listen to the EU now?
I am more.
Why do you only agree with the EU when it agrees with your position?
Because the EU has a vested interest against Russia. So when they, so when, and you're talking over me again.
EU is right when it agrees.
You're talking over me again.
EU is wrong when it doesn't.
You're talking over me. When the EU, who has a vested interest against Russia, concedes something to Russia, I'm much more apt to believe that, in the same way that if Russia concedes something to the EU when it has a vested interest to not concede it because there is a rivalry between the EU and Russia, I'd be much more likely to believe that too. I am much less likely to believe the EU presenting something self-serving, and if Russia presents something self-serving, obviously.
The only thing I read the thing. I didn't read the EU report in 2008. In 2008, I think I was playing PlayStation 2 and playing with Matchbox cars or something. But it seems, from what I'm reading, the report seems to place the blame on the Russians provoking the Georgians, and then the Georgians over responding to the provocation.
You're wrong.
No, you're wrong, Lactoid. I've researched this topic. You were just misrepresenting.
I just Googled it. I mean, I don't know what it is. Maybe I'm reading it incorrectly.
The conclusion? What was the conclusion that Georgia started?
Well, let me read.
Yes or no? Yes or no? Was the conclusion that Georgia was responsible for starting the conflict?
I mean, started it how? You mean like did they?
Was the conclusion? Was the stated conclusion? Yes or no? It's a very straightforward question. Was the stated conclusion of the report that Georgia was the one who started the conflict?
When you say started the conflict, do you mean ground incursions or artillery fire?
The report held them responsible for just starting the conflict. That if they were the one who were deemed to be the starters of the conflict. Yes or no?
They take a lot of the blame, but when you say starter of the conflict, that assumes they fired the first shot.
I'm saying the EU blamed them for starting the conflict.
They put a lot of the blame on them for making the conflict what it was by over-responding to Russian provocations. That's what the report says.
Wait. When you talk about blame, when people talk about any kind of conflict or any battle or incursion or a shift in the conflict, they talk about how there are underlying issues, and then there are also triggering events like a particular battle or a particular ceasefire that's broken. They're saying that Georgia were the ones who seemed to fire the first shot in this particular phase of the conflict, but the underlying issue, and I think the EU report says this as well, is the fact that Russia is in Abkhazia and South Ossetia with their military when they should not be there.
The ceasefire.
Do you disagree with that?
I do disagree, because when you sign a ceasefire, when you have an agreement that you're not going to do this, and then you do it, you're responsible for breaking that, right?
That does not contradict anything I said, but okay,
yeah, but your point doesn't address anything I said either. So okay, fine.
No, it does address it. It addresses the fact that Georgia was found responsible for breaking a ceasefire, but not for the underlying violation and the underlying injustice or the underlying problem here, which is that Russia is in an area where they should not be.
That Georgia agreed to in a ceasefire that they could be. Because that ceasefire was in place. They were there. Georgia broke the ceasefire.
Do you think Georgia agreeing to a ceasefire is them consenting to Russia being in Abkhazia and South Ossetia?
Well, no, it means that they're responsible if they break it.
For a triggering event.
A triggering event. But you're missing the point of the conversation. I brought up Georgia specifically to counter not like the very specific narrative that Russia takes these advantages whenever it can. And in 2008, Russia very easily could have used this as a pretext to take all of Georgia because their troops were in Georgia proper, but that's not what they did. They pulled out, and they weren't even the ones who started it.
So they use it to hold on to territory that they're already claiming that's not theirs. Like, okay,
but again, they did start it.
Yeah, they didn't take more territory that's not theirs. They just kept on to they just held on to the territory that they already have. After quite a few other numbers of their opponents fled the area and didn't go back.
Okay, yeah. I'm gonna read these super chats. $2 from Esoteric Dichotomy to say we are pro-Ukraine chat, down with Putin. True. $2 from Kick Nostanza to say ask Lactoid if he thinks Putin is a dictator. Putin is a dictator, yes or no? What do you think, Lactoid?
No, I don't think he's a dictator. I think he's an oligarch president to some degree, but I don't think he's a dictator.
Okay. $5 from Lopan to say, still waiting for libs to demand North Korea be re-engaged. The quote-unquote world cannot just let communists get away with aggressively taking land. $5 more from Lopan to say, if Ukraine accepts a deal, will anyone here admit they were wrong? Will you admit you were wrong if Ukraine accepts a deal?
Wrong about what?
Depends on what the deal is. Like,
all of us gave
Yeah.
All of us also gave some percentage of it succeeding. So if it succeeds, none of us are wrong.
wow.
$2 from Killer Tomato to say only Burns can interrupt plebe. $2 from Fireburn to say liberals are suddenly nationalists. LOL. $10 from Majin to say Lactoid is the GOAT. Easy clap. Another W for Russia. LOL. And then $20 from the same person to say another super chat for the GOAT Wick, because he is the GOAT. Well, I appreciate the money. $5 from Usurp to say if Lactoid is one of Russia's strongest soldiers, then LOL, LOL, LOL. Dave Timmerman for €2 to say what is the good faith Russia horseshit? $2 from Trib1 to say should NATO be disbanded and why or why not? For $2, we're not going to have a discussion for that.
The quick answer is no. But
yeah, Fireburn for $2 says Burns fails the marshmallow test. Is Fireburn like your hater? Does he go around like just super chatting?
Is that to me or?
Yeah, it's to you. It says Burns fails the marshmallow test.
I don't even know. I don't know what the marshmallow test is, but I like marshmallows.
If you were offered, you can have one marshmallow now, or if you wait a day, you get 5 marshmallows. Which would you take? And people who fail the marshmallow test take the first marshmallow.
I'd take the first marshmallow.
Okay, fair enough. $2 for Gay Ben to say Burns thinks well poisoning is a moral duty. $5 from Satan to say, I bet Burns is swimming in Ukraine trim, considering all the men have been deleted. That's why he likes being there. Shame the devil and tell him the truth.
Ukraine trim? What?
I don't know.
I don't know what Ukraine trim means.
I'm assuming by context that means women, but I'm not sure.
Oh.
I don't know. $5 from President Sunday to say reminder.
The actual one?
I don't know. In the comment, it might be. Reminder, the Destiny recorded Cherry without consent and threatened and doxed multiple people who called him out for it. Have a good panel, Bugman. That has nothing to do with anything we're talking about today, but thank you for the $5.
That is another good reason to bomb Russia.
It's $5 Canadian too, so you know. $5 from the Trib One to say if the poll is reality, the resolution would be to give people in Crimea a path to Russia. No need for invasion. They could just shepherd them to Russia.
Can I say one thing on that? They tried to have a vote in 1992, and they tried in 1995, and both times were shut down. And then in 2010, when they finally decided, fine, we're going to play by the rules and vote in the election of the Constitution that you put us under, then they overthrew the president. So I don't think they really had any reason to believe that the Ukrainians were going to just let them leave. Crimea is too valuable for that.
Sure. $5 from the Trib One to say Trump will truth out that the deal fell apart due to Zelensky not playing ball, and he'll make sure to let Ukraine know that they don't hold the cards. And then finally, $2 from the Trib One to say, do you all disagree with the 70% chance of it happening? I think we both, all of us agree that's not a realistic number, but I could be wrong. Okay, gang. We have talked about all sorts of things on this show. Unfortunately, we didn't get as much chance as I would have liked to kind of go over what we think the future is going to be. We were all arguing about the past, and it is important to discuss. And I do thank you all for being here. I do apologize for the quote-unquote lopsided nature of this panel. We did have someone to be on Lactoid's side, but it did not work out. And 10 minutes before showtime, he was like, I can't do it anymore. And that sucks, but show must go on. Okay, with that, I'm going to give each of these lovely individuals a chance to give closing thoughts, closing statements, and maybe I would ask you to give a closing prediction of what will happen tomorrow, because we'll be able to find out how right you were tomorrow. So it'll be interesting for people to watch this in the future to see if you were correct or just super, super wrong. We're going to give it to Lonerbox first, then we're going to go around and we'll see how it goes. Go ahead, Lonerbox.
Okay, fuck. I think I guess we've seen quite a lot of like very strange, disanalogous comparisons to conflicts that are not really comparable to anything that has happened with Russia and any of their neighbors. The fact is that Russia, before the Soviet Union, was an empire. They conquered territory. They pushed their people into that territory. They fucked with people's languages and their culture, and they Russified areas. And they did the same thing under the Soviet Union. So when the Soviet Union collapsed and these countries were, these republics were divided into different countries, they got incredibly fucking butthurt and decided that especially their leaders, decided that they wanted to reclaim whichever pieces of influence that they could. They say it to this day that they think the fall of the Soviet Union was the biggest catastrophe of the last 100 years, worse than the Holocaust, I guess. And they will use that position and that fact that there is still Russian presence in some of these areas, even if it's very small, like in parts of Georgia, and they will use difficulties and human rights violations and other tensions that occur in these areas to their advantage and use them as opportunities to bring their troops in and to reclaim territory that they think is rightfully theirs, or that they can just hold on to in a frozen conflict that they're never going to get pushed out of because they're quite a big force. And they will use the idea of like very, very difficult to justify threats when it comes to NATO in Europe, even though NATO already borders Russia in several countries and can actually advance nuclear weapons and everything else quite close to the country. There's a reason countries like Canada don't seek out the help of and the military aid of American adversaries. It's a very simple reason that America doesn't fuck with their territory in the same way that Russia does with former Soviet countries. No one makes a former Soviet country want to join NATO more than Russia. That's what they do. They fuck with these former Soviet countries. They make other Soviet countries that haven't been fucked with yet legitimately afraid enough that they beg to be in NATO. So if Russia doesn't like NATO, then stop fucking with former Soviet countries. Very simple. As for Ukraine, it's a real shame that Ukraine is probably not going to get a hold of their 2014 borders anytime soon, if even ever. That's just the sad truth of geopolitics and the world that we live in. But I think the best that Ukraine's allies in Europe and America can do is to use the strength that they have to at least make it so that Russia pays a price for such an act of aggression. Because if they don't feel like they've paid a price for it, they're going to do more of it.
Okay. Thank you for being here, Lonerbox. Always appreciate you. Always like having your perspective here. Thank you for being here. Go check him out at his channel. I have links to all these individuals in my YouTube description, and they've all taken time out of their day to come and give us content, so please reward them for it. Dylan Burns, please.
I wasn't informed I was giving you content, Wick. I wouldn't have agreed to this.
I know, it's crazy, right?
First, I want to accept Wick's apology for stacking the panel against me. I think I did quite well with the odds stacked against me. You know, the war is pretty awful right now. In June and July, it was the most deadly month for civilians for the entirety of the war since the opening months, due to an increase in civilian strikes and human safari tactics, that is drones and FPVs being used to hit fire trucks, ambulance trucks, civilian evacuation vehicles, a lot of civilian cars and people walking around, especially in areas where anywhere that there's Ukrainian military activity, but especially in the city of Kherson and elsewhere. And it's getting more violent. So there's a real desire I have to not have to keep listening to those buzzing drones. Quite frankly, I would like to sit on my couch and play Red Dead 2 and smoke, like most people my age. But I do think that what's happening there needs to be documented. And I don't think that passivity is going to be what brings the solution here. I really wish I was wrong about Trump. I really wish Trump brought peace in 24 hours. As much as I never believed in it, I always wanted it. I don't want everybody there to keep dying. It's really sad to see people buried in shallow graves in their own community because it's too dangerous to take their bodies away. So they're buried in their own front yards. And you don't want that to keep going. But every unilateral ceasefire offer has been rejected. All deadlines have been passed. All frameworks have been disregarded. And the limited ceasefires that were supposedly negotiated were immediately violated. Many might forget it, but early on during the Trump presidency, he did negotiate a civilian infrastructure ceasefire, which was almost immediately violated. So I don't have high hopes for tomorrow. And I really do not think that we're going to be able to change the Russians' mind by just talking ethics and talking morals. I think the conditions have to change. I really do think ultimately it has to be so costly for the Russians to even think about engaging in another war like this is the only way you're going to stop it. Not by making it so it'd be easier to invade Ukraine through disarmament, getting rid of their most defensible positions, or by doing things that would undermine their national security or Europe's national security by extension. So I just want to put forward that while the Russians are pushing forward every day, John McNamara could put forward a bunch of numbers that would be good. Mr. McNamara could put numbers that are really good during the Vietnam War, and they could be good in isolation. But if you drag that out and you aren't seeing the breakthrough that the Russian offensive operations request, because at the rate of even the Russian advances at this point, if they were to keep up this rate, it would take them years and years and years and years to reach their objectives. So we need to change it so that that timeline is so far in the distance that they have no choice but to say, it's not worth it. We can't keep this war going for 12 years in the hope that we'll retake X, Y, and Z. And at that point, when the Russians are faced with a choice between grinding their society and their demographics down and cutting their losses, so to speak, the hope would be that they'd cut their losses. But given the record, who knows?
Well, thank you for being here, Dylan. And you can find his work on his YouTube channel, which I've linked below. Check that out. Really appreciate you. Last but certainly not least, Lactoid.
I'm Lactoid. You can find me at Lactoid TV on Twitch or on YouTube. It was great to have this conversation and to speak frankly, I think dispel a lot of myths that are sort of believed as to this specific conflict. I didn't obviously, as I've said, have enough time to sort of get through all of them. There's a lot of like sort of quick falsehoods that people will give you about Euromaidan, about the will of the Crimean people, about the start of this conflict, about what Russia wants to end it. Most normies probably just think this war came out of nowhere. They don't even know about the conflict that was happening between 2014 and 2022. They don't even know anything about Euromaidan. They don't know about the Ukrainian constitution. They don't know about any of this stuff. So I think it's important, as somebody who values dispelling myths, to have these kind of conversations. So I have the opportunity to do that. For those of you who kind of heard the back and forth, I highly advise that you do your own research, or if you want me to provide sources for any of the specific claims I made, go ahead and you can reach out to me. You can send me a request for a source. You can even potentially say what I said, or send me a clip of what I said, or something along those lines, and I'd be happy to oblige. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks for being here, and I appreciate you willing to come, even if your partner decided to ditch us. That sucks. Okay.
Oh, hey, congratulations on coming out. I had no clue, Lactoid.
What about what now?
Your
He's
partner.
making a joke,
They didn't
partner
come.
joke with the gay. It's a joke.
Oh, okay.
I believe. What do we got coming up? So no stream tomorrow, but on Monday I'll be debating against Christian nationalism. It'll be me and my buddy Eucharist against Rattlesnake Jake and Eli Nix, and that'll be fun.
Rattlesnake Jake.
Yes, that's his name. Yeah, it's a very big YouTube thing. He does this show with Andrew Wilson on Rumble. Andrew Wilson, by the way, who offered me $20,000 to go 3 rounds in the ring with him, boxing. And then when I accepted it and gave him a date, he ghosted me. I haven't heard from him since. He hasn't said one word. So, that guy. Then
he offered me a boxing match a while ago too. He didn't offer me no $20,000. I'll do it for $20K. Shit, I'll abandon the war for a few months.
That's what I said. Like, even if I lost, I'd do it for fucking $20,000.
I'll step away from the front. Hell, we'll do it in Kiev. We'll do it for charity.
The killing in Kiev. We could, it'd be fun. We'll make a whole production from it. Anyway, then on Thursday, Soy Pill called me an incel, and so he's going to try to de-incelify Wick, and we're going to have a panel about that. So tune in for that. And then on Wednesday, we're probably just going to have some call-ins, and then Friday we'll think of something. Anyway, I love you all. I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.